Good evening. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the place where history helps you slow down, settle in, and maybe even drift off. Before we begin tonight's journey, make sure you're tucked in and warm. Pull up your blanket, dim the lights, and let your mind start to wander. If you're joining us again, welcome back. And if this is your first time here, I'm so glad you found your way. While you're getting cozy, feel free to subscribe so you don't miss the next quiet adventure. Leave a comment if you'd like. Let us know where in the world you're listening from, or simply say hello. And if something tonight makes you curious or thoughtful, share that too. We read everything, quietly and kindly. Now, tonight's story takes us far back into the shadows of the medieval world. A time of stone castles, flickering torchlight, and thick silence behind heavy wooden doors. We'll be exploring a difficult truth, one that's often left out of fairy tales. It's about how medieval men, in many places and classes, tried to control women, not only in public, but in private too. This included the most personal parts of life, marriage, intimacy, and the rules that lived behind closed doors. But don't worry. As always, we'll take our time. We won't rush. We won't use upsetting words. Instead, we'll walk gently through castle halls and quiet village paths. We'll look at old customs, church laws, marriage contracts, and whispered expectations. We'll ask, what could a wife expect on her wedding night? Who decided what was allowed in a marriage? How did religion shape desire? And what did the church teach about love, obedience, and shame? This story uses calm, simple English. Whether you're new to history, learning about storytelling, or just here to rest, everything will be easy to follow. You might even drift off before the end. That's all right. So lie back, get comfortable, and imagine the cold stone walls of a medieval manor. The air is still. The candle flickers. The world moves slowly. This is not a story of kings and battles. It's a story of private lives, quiet rules, and the invisible lines that shaped them. Let's begin. Imagine yourself as a young woman in the year 1250. You might be 14 or 15. You live in a small village, maybe in France, England, or the Holy Roman Empire. Your home is simple, with a dirt floor, no windows, and a fire in the center for cooking. You help your mother with weaving or caring for animals. You do not choose your husband. Instead, your marriage is arranged. Your parents decide who you will marry, usually based on land, money, or social ties. Sometimes the church is involved too. Marriage is not really about love. It is about duty. It is about property. And for your husband, it is often about control. Once married, your life changes overnight. You move into your husband's home. You are now expected to serve him in every way. You must cook for him, keep the home, and yes, share his bed. Even if you're afraid, even if you don't understand what that means. In medieval Europe, the church taught that women were naturally weaker than men. Not just physically, but morally. Church leaders said that Eve had brought sin into the world, and so women must be watched carefully. A wife had to obey her husband, and this obedience extended into the bedroom. There were church laws that made this very clear. These rules were called canon law. According to canon law, a husband had a right to his wife's body. If a wife refused sex, without a very good reason like illness or fasting, she could be punished, even by the church itself. A strange term appeared in these laws, the marital debt. This meant that both husband and wife owed each other sex. But in practice, it usually meant the wife had to say yes when the husband asked. Even if she was tired. Even if she was frightened. Even if she didn't want to. Let's stop here for a moment. It is important to say this gently and clearly. These were real people, not characters in a story. And this part of life was confusing, painful, and often lonely for many women. But even here, the rules were complex. In some cases, a man could be punished for being cruel to his wife in bed. There were stories of women who went to the church courts and said their husbands were hurting them, or forcing them in ways that were not considered acceptable. This tells us something important. Even in a time when men had power, there were some limits. These limits were not always fair or strong, but they existed. Now let's imagine the marriage bed itself. It might be just a straw mattress on a wooden frame, shared by both husband and wife. It might be in the corner of a single-room cottage, or behind a curtain in a small manor. Privacy was rare. In many homes, children, relatives, or servants might sleep nearby. And yet, the wife was expected to act like the bed belonged to her husband, that her body was part of his rights as a man. This control was often justified by religion. Priests said that sex was allowed only in marriage, and only for making children. Desire, especially in women, was treated as something dangerous or shameful. But here is a strange twist. The church also said that sex was not a sin if it happened within marriage. So a husband could demand it, and a wife could not easily say no. But at the same time, both were supposed to act ashamed of it. Imagine living under those rules. Every part of your private life is judged by people outside your home, priests, neighbors, even the law. You are not allowed to talk openly about your feelings or your fears. If you complain, you might be punished or sent back to your parents. In wealthier homes, the rules were even stricter. A noble woman might be watched constantly by servants, nurses, or other family members. Her value was tied to her body, her purity, her ability to produce children. Her husband might keep her in a separate room, or limit when she could leave the castle. There were even books written for husbands, telling them how to control their wives. One such book, written much later, was called the Malleus Maleficarum. It wasn't exactly a marriage guide, but it talked about how dangerous women could be if not kept in check. It was full of fear and control. All of this created a world where women's bodies were not their own. From the moment of marriage, a wife's role was shaped by rules written by men, enforced by religion, and accepted by most of society. Still, some women pushed back. Quietly, carefully, they found ways to resist. Some refused their husbands. Some sought help from the church. Some became nuns to escape marriage altogether. Some used herbs to control pregnancy. These small acts of resistance did not change the system. But they show us that women were never just silent victims. They were people, thinking, feeling, hoping. The marriage bed, then, was more than a place to sleep. It was a place where power lived. Power given to men, taken from women, and wrapped in the soft words of religion and duty. As we leave this first segment, keep this image in your mind: a quiet room, a straw bed, a flickering candle, and a young woman lying awake, wondering what tomorrow will bring. We'll continue soon with our next topic: how medieval clothing and rules about appearance were used to control women's behavior and sexuality. The rules of modesty, clothing as control. Now, let's continue our quiet walk through the medieval world. This time, we're stepping out of the home and into the public eye. Imagine the early morning light in a small medieval town. Narrow cobbled streets. Stone buildings with wooden upper floors leaning out over the lane. The smell of bread from an oven. You pass by women sweeping steps, drawing water, or hanging laundry on lines stretched between windows. But look closer at what they are wearing. Their clothes are not just to keep warm. They are part of a strict system. A system that told people who they were, rich or poor, good or bad, respectable or shameful. In medieval Europe, a woman's clothing was more than fabric. It was a signal, and it was carefully watched. Men, especially husbands, priests, and city leaders, expected women to dress in a way that showed modesty, obedience, and control. Let's start with head coverings. A married woman was expected to keep her hair hidden. This was based on religious teachings. The Bible said that a woman's hair was her glory, and so it should be covered to avoid tempting men. So women wore veils, wimples, or long cloths wrapped around their heads and necks. In some towns, a woman who went out with her hair uncovered could be fined. In others, she could be punished by the church. Now think about the shape of the clothes. Loose. Covered. Nothing too tight. Nothing too bright. The goal was to make the body less visible. Not to stand out. Not to draw attention. And again, this wasn't just about fashion. It was about power. If a woman dressed in a way that others thought was too bold or proud, they might call her a temptress or accuse her of bad behavior, even if she had done nothing wrong. This is part of a bigger idea in the medieval world: the belief that women were naturally more likely to sin, especially through their bodies. So the solution, people thought, was to control those bodies through clothing. Let's imagine a married woman in a town like Bruges or York. She puts on her long wool dress, her apron, and her veil before going to market. She avoids bright red or purple. Those colors might be seen as too proud. She wears simple shoes. She keeps her eyes down. Her clothing is saying, "I am a good wife. I am not trying to tempt. I belong to my husband." Now think of how this looked in the homes of the wealthy. Rich women also had to follow rules. Even though they could afford silks and jewels, they had to be careful. Too much display might bring gossip or jealousy. Still, noble women often used clothing to send messages, not of freedom, but of control. They might wear tight-laced bodices, long sleeves that dragged the ground, or stiff collars. These were not practical. They were meant to show that the woman did not need to work, that she was valuable, protected, owned. In some places, city laws called sumptuary laws were created to make these rules even stricter. These laws said who could wear what, based on class and gender. For example, in Florence, a law might say that only married women could wear certain fabrics. In England, there were limits on how many fur-lined garments a woman could own. If a woman dressed above her station, people might say she was pretending to be something she was not. Or worse, they might say she was trying to seduce men. This tells us something sad and powerful. In many medieval minds, a woman's body was always being judged. Not just by what she did, but by how she looked. And again, these judgments were not always private. A woman could be punished publicly for dressing the wrong way. Some towns forced women to wear special clothes as a form of shame. Others made rules for widows, prostitutes, or unmarried mothers, telling them exactly what to wear. In one part of France, prostitutes had to wear a striped hood. In another, they had to walk barefoot to show their shame. These rules were not about protection. They were about control, about showing who had power. But just like in the home, women sometimes pushed back. They found ways to express themselves quietly. They might add embroidery to a sleeve. They might wear a secret ribbon under their veil. There are records of women who went to court to argue for the right to wear certain colors, or who found clever ways to bend the rules. One story tells of a woman who wore men's shoes to walk through muddy streets, and was fined for doing so. Let's stop for a moment and reflect. The medieval world was full of rules. Rules about what women could wear, how they could speak, where they could go. These rules were enforced by men, often using religion, law, and tradition. But the purpose was almost always the same: to make sure women stayed under control. Now picture this. A narrow alley, a quiet breeze. A young woman in a plain dress steps into the street, her head covered, her face calm. She is doing nothing wrong, but she still feels eyes watching her, judging her clothes, her steps, her silence. This is the world she lives in. As we end this segment, remember this: clothing in the medieval world was not about choice. For most women, it was a costume designed by someone else. A message stitched in wool and linen. A symbol of who they were allowed to be. And next, we will step into the church, into the sermons, confessions, and quiet corners where priests taught women what they could and could not do, even in their most private moments. Let's now step into the heart of medieval power, not a castle, not a court, but a church. Imagine yourself seated on a rough wooden bench in a small village chapel. The walls are cold stone. A single stained glass window lets colored light fall across the floor. A priest stands at the front, reading from a Latin text. Most people in the room cannot understand the words, but they still listen, carefully, fearfully, because what the church says is not just advice. It is law. It is the path to heaven, or to hell. In medieval Europe, the church played a major role in every part of life. This included what people ate, what they wore, and most especially what they did in the bedroom. From the moment of birth to the hour of death, the church was there. Babies were baptized. Marriages were blessed. Sins were confessed. Even private matters were seen as the church's business. Let's start with marriage. The church said that marriage was a holy sacrament, a sacred promise between a man, a woman, and God. But this did not mean the church saw marriage as romantic. In fact, it was full of warnings. Priests taught that sex was only allowed for one reason: to make children. If a couple had sex for pleasure alone, it was considered sinful. This teaching came from early church thinkers, like St. Augustine. He believed that desire was dangerous, that even married people should try to avoid passion. He even said that if people could have children without sex, that would be better. These ideas shaped everything. Let's imagine a young couple, newly married, going to confession for the first time. The priest might ask them detailed questions. Did you lie with your spouse? Did you enjoy it too much? Did you do anything unnatural? The list of forbidden acts was long. Even between husband and wife, the church banned certain positions, times, and behaviors. For example, sex was not allowed on Sundays, feast days, during Lent, or while a woman was pregnant or nursing. That left very few safe days. And the rules were strict. Some priests told couples that even enjoying intimacy too much could be a venial sin, a smaller sin, but one that still stained the soul. Others said that if a husband asked for sex too often, he might be guilty of lust. But the harshest judgment was often for the woman. If a wife enjoyed sex or showed desire, she could be seen as dangerous. This fear went back to the story of Eve, the idea that women led men to sin. So women were told to be silent, passive, and ashamed. Many church texts said that a wife should never initiate intimacy. She should not speak of it. She should not even seem to enjoy it. Her role was to submit. One famous medieval manual, the Decretum Gratiani, explained it this way: a wife who refuses her husband may be excommunicated, but a husband who refuses his wife may be forgiven. This double standard was everywhere. Men were told to lead. Women were told to obey. And if a woman stepped outside those lines, she could be punished, not just by her husband, but by the church. Let's now walk into a darker part of this world, the church court. In these courts, people were judged for spiritual crimes. These included adultery, refusal of the marital debt, or even unnatural acts within marriage. Sometimes a woman would be accused by her own husband. He might say she denied him his rights, or that she tempted him into sinful behavior. In some rare cases, women went to court themselves, saying their husbands were cruel or unfaithful. But often they lost. This was not a system built to protect women. It was built to protect order. And in this order, men ruled the home. Even church art reflected this idea. In many paintings and carvings, women were shown as weak, weeping, or sinful. Men were shown as strong, holy, and wise. These images shaped how people saw each other and themselves. But not all church voices were harsh. Some priests spoke kindly about marriage. Some said that love between husband and wife was a gift. A few even wrote songs or poems celebrating faithful, gentle love. One rare example comes from a medieval bishop named Andreas Capellanus. He wrote about courtly love, a kind of noble affection that involved respect, patience, and beauty. But even this ideal was for the elite, not the everyday wife working in a village kitchen. So what did this mean for a woman's life? It meant she was taught to see her own body as sinful, to see her feelings as dangerous, to see obedience as her highest virtue. It meant that her most personal choices were not really hers at all. Even in confession, a private moment, her thoughts and actions were judged. Her priest might ask her, in a calm voice, if she had disobeyed her husband, if she had taken pleasure in her role, if she had resisted his authority in any way. And she would whisper her answer, ashamed, afraid, hoping for forgiveness. Let's now pause. Picture a dark wooden confessional. A woman kneels in the cold. Her voice is low. Her head is covered. She is not a criminal. She is simply a wife, trying to survive in a world that says her soul is tied to her silence. This is how the church shaped not only rules, but beliefs. Beliefs that lasted for centuries. Yet, even here, we find quiet resistance. Some women found ways to speak back. They joined convents. They became mystics. They wrote letters, or taught other women in secret. These women, like Hildegard of Bingen or Julian of Norwich, used religious language to talk about love, beauty, and even the body, in ways that gave women hope. So while the church controlled many voices, not all were silent, and not all were lost. As we close this segment, think of the quiet echo of footsteps in a cold church aisle, the stillness of candlelight, the sound of whispered prayers. And remember that for many women, the most personal part of life was watched, judged, and shaped by others. In the next segment, we'll look at how family members and even neighbors helped enforce these rules in everyday life. How communities worked together to make sure women stayed in their place. Let's move now from the quiet space of the church to the busy, shared spaces of daily life. The home, the village square, the marketplace. In the medieval world, a woman was never truly alone. Her choices, her movements, and her behavior were watched not just by her husband or her priest, but by everyone around her. This watching was not always cruel. Sometimes it came from people who cared, mothers, grandmothers, neighbors who thought they were helping. But it created a world where every step a woman took, every word she spoke, and even every expression on her face could be questioned. Imagine you are a married woman in a small village in 1300. You wake before dawn to light the fire, prepare food, and fetch water. You nod to the woman next door as you walk to the well. She nods back, but her eyes scan your veil, your dress, your face. Did you look too proud? Did your dress seem too fine? Did you smile at the baker too long? These thoughts might stay quiet, or they might spread. In small communities, gossip moved faster than the wind. And gossip in the medieval world had power. It could bring shame. It could bring punishment. One of the most important concepts in this time was a woman's reputation. Reputation was more than how people saw you. It was a kind of social currency, a form of invisible credit that shaped what you could do, where you could go, and how people treated you. For married women, a good reputation meant being obedient, quiet, modest, and faithful. For unmarried women, it meant being pure, silent, and ready to marry. If a woman was seen as too loud, too friendly, or too bold, people might say she had loose morals. Even if she had done nothing wrong, the rumor alone could damage her life. She might be denied work, or marriage, or even charity. Let's pause here and picture something very ordinary. A woman helping her husband in the fields. She bends to pull weeds, lifts heavy buckets of water, and tends the animals. She works as hard as any man. But still, her neighbors may judge her not by her work, but by how she behaves. Is she respectful? Is she obedient? Does she walk beside her husband or behind him? Does she lower her eyes when speaking to men? Even laughter could be questioned. A woman who laughed too much or too freely might be seen as immoral. This constant watching shaped how women acted, not just in public but in private too. Over time, many began to police themselves. They became careful with their words, their clothes, their expressions. And this kind of control was passed down. Mothers taught their daughters how to avoid shame. Older women warned younger ones about the dangers of being seen as too much, too bold, too clever, too free. Sometimes, entire households worked together to keep a woman in her place. Fathers arranged marriages. Brothers acted as protectors. Servants and relatives reported any signs of disobedience. Even within the home, privacy was rare. Most families shared a single room. Doors were open. Curtains were thin. Children slept nearby. Every word spoken, every decision made could be heard and judged. And if a woman did something that was truly seen as wrong, if she resisted a husband, refused sex, or was suspected of adultery, her punishment might not come only from the law. It could come from her own family. In some cases, husbands beat their wives with approval from the community. This was called correction, and it was considered a private matter. Unless the violence became extreme, others would not interfere. If a wife ran away, neighbors might bring her back. If she complained, the priest might remind her of her duty. If she cried, she might be told to pray. Even the architecture supported this control. In some homes, women had separate spaces where they were expected to stay. In castles, noble women might be kept in upper rooms, away from visitors. In cities, widows might be shut away in special houses called beguinages, safe but also cut off. And all of this watching served a single purpose: to protect male authority. A woman who behaved properly made her husband look strong. A woman who misbehaved made him look weak. So he had a reason to watch her, and to make sure others watched too. But again, we must not think that all women simply accepted this. Some found small ways to resist. They whispered to each other in corners. They formed tight bonds with other women. They shared stories, warnings, and jokes. Some women used the same tools of gossip and rumor to protect themselves or to fight back. If a man was cruel, word might spread. If a woman was unfairly punished, others might come to her side. This hidden network of care, built by women for women, gave some relief. But it could not erase the system. As we near the end of this segment, let's return to our village street. A woman walks slowly, carrying a basket. Her steps are measured. Her face is calm. Around her, eyes flicker, watching, weighing, remembering. Not because she has done anything wrong, but because she exists in a world where her behavior defines her worth. In the next segment, we will look at the legal side, how marriage contracts, dowries, and inheritance laws gave men even more control over women's bodies and choices. We've walked through bedrooms, churches, and village lanes. Now it's time to turn to parchment and ink. Tonight, we look at how the law itself helped shape and support a man's control over a woman's body, especially through marriage contracts, dowries, and rules about property. Let's begin with a quiet room. The table is simple. The air smells of wax and dust. A man dips a feathered quill into ink. Slowly, he writes out a marriage contract. But this contract is not about love. It's about land, money, names, control. In the medieval world, marriage was often seen as a legal agreement between two families, not two individuals. The most important parts of this agreement had little to do with affection or feelings. What mattered were the terms, the size of the dowry, the rights of the husband, the duties of the wife. Let's break this down. What was a dowry? A dowry was a gift of money, land, goods, or livestock that a bride's family gave to the groom. Sometimes, this payment went directly to the husband. Other times, it was set aside for the wife's future, if she became a widow, for example. But even in cases where the dowry was meant for her security, the husband usually controlled it during the marriage. He could spend it, he could invest it, he could even lose it. The dowry made the woman's value visible. Bigger dowry, better match. Smaller dowry, lower status. This financial side of marriage meant that husbands often felt they had paid for their wives. And that gave them a sense of ownership, not just of property, but of the woman herself. Let's imagine a merchant in Italy. He arranges for his daughter to marry another merchant's son. The contract is drawn. The dowry is 10 silver coins, a chest of linens, and a small vineyard. She brings all of it with her when she moves into her husband's house. But from that day on, it is no longer truly hers. Now, let's look at another part of the legal system, inheritance. In most parts of medieval Europe, women could not inherit property in the same way men could. In some regions, only sons inherited. In others, daughters could receive a share, but often much smaller than their brothers. Even when a woman did inherit land or wealth, she usually lost control over it once she married. Her husband became the legal head of the household, which meant he controlled everything: land, money, animals, even household servants. This legal control extended to the woman's body. Remember the idea of marital debt from earlier segments? The law backed that idea. It said that a husband had a right to his wife's body, for producing children, for sex, for labor. In many cases, women could not legally refuse. The husband was seen as the one in charge. The courts, the church, and the community usually supported him. Let's picture a nobleman and his wife. Their marriage is formal. Cold. He wants an heir. She does not yet have children. The pressure builds. She is told to do her duty. Even if she is sick. Even if she is afraid. If she refuses, he can complain to the church. Or worse, he might accuse her of being a bad wife, or of being unfaithful. Consent, as we understand it today, was not part of the system. This did not mean that all husbands were cruel, or that all marriages were unhappy. Some couples cared for each other. Some found comfort. But the legal system did not protect the wife's voice. It protected the husband's power. There were very few ways a woman could escape a bad marriage. Divorce was almost impossible in most of medieval Europe. The church allowed annulments in rare cases. If the marriage had not been consummated, or if it was proven that one partner had lied or was already married. But these were hard to win, and they often required money or noble connections. More often, women were stuck. Now let's consider the case of a widow. When her husband died, she might regain some rights, like control over her dowry or a piece of his estate. This was called her dower. But again, the law had rules. If she remarried, the new husband took control. If she stayed single, she had more freedom, but also more risk. Some towns gave widows more legal protection. Others forced them into religious life or back into marriage. Even unmarried women had few options. A woman who refused to marry might be seen as disobedient. If she lived alone, people might assume she was immoral. The law often did not protect her. Sometimes, families used contracts to force women into marriages they did not want. Fathers could promise daughters to much older men. If a woman resisted, she might be threatened with disinheritance or shame. And in many places, the law allowed this. There are stories of women being married off before they were even fully grown, sometimes at age 12 or 13. This was legal in many regions. Once the marriage contract was signed and the union consummated, the woman had no easy way out. This made the marriage bed not a place of safety, but a legal trap. Yet, again, there were cracks in the system. Some women managed to challenge the law. They filed complaints. They fought for their dower rights. They sought help from sympathetic judges or powerful relatives. Records from England, France, and Italy show that some women won court cases against husbands or guardians. Their voices, though rare, remind us that women were not always silent. They knew the law. They used what tools they had. And sometimes they won. Let's end this segment by returning to the image of that quiet table, with the ink-stained parchment and the sharp smell of wax. The marriage contract lies open. It names the bride, the groom, the dowry. But it does not ask how the bride feels. It does not ask if she wants this life. It simply records what is expected, what is owed, what must be given. And behind those words lies a quiet truth. That law itself was one of the sharpest tools used to control women in the medieval world. In the next segment, we'll look at how medical beliefs, especially about women's bodies, gave men even more reasons to dominate the bedroom and control reproduction. Let's now step quietly into a medieval physician's study. It's dim, lit by flickering candlelight. Dried herbs hang from the ceiling. Heavy books rest on a wooden shelf. You can smell ink, old paper, and the earthy scent of crushed roots. This is where men studied the body and made decisions about how it worked, what it meant, and how it should be treated. But tonight, we are not here to learn real science. We are here to understand how beliefs, not facts, help justify the control of women. In the medieval world, medicine was not based on modern biology. It was based on older ideas, especially from the ancient Greek and Roman worlds. The most important theory was the humor system. According to this system, the body was made up of 4 fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health came from balance. Illness came from imbalance. But here is where it gets strange. Medieval doctors believed that men and women had different balances of humors. Men were thought to be dry, warm, and stable. Women were believed to be cold, wet, and unstable. These ideas had nothing to do with science, but they shaped how people thought about the female body, and especially how men thought about it. Let's begin with the idea of female weakness. Because women were thought to be cold and wet, doctors believed they were more emotional, more passive, and more easily affected by outside forces. Their bodies were seen as soft and leaky. This led to a strange belief that women had to have sex to stay healthy. Some medieval texts claimed that if a woman didn't release certain fluids during intimacy, she might become sick or hysterical. This idea was dangerous. It suggested that women needed sex more than they admitted, and that husbands had a duty to make sure their wives released those fluids regularly. This was often used to explain women's behavior. If a woman was angry or sad, some doctors said she needed more marital contact. Her womb was wandering, they said. Her body was restless. The womb, in particular, was a mystery in medieval medicine. Some believed it could move around the body. If a woman was sick or behaving strangely, they said it was because her womb had risen to her chest or throat. This was called wandering womb syndrome, and it led to treatments that sound strange and even cruel today. Doctors would place sweet-smelling herbs near the woman's lower body and foul-smelling items near her nose, trying to lure the womb back into place. This might sound silly now, but these ideas were taken seriously, and they were used to explain why women needed to be married, why they needed to be sexually active, and why they could not be trusted to care for their own health. Let's pause here. Imagine being told that your own body was a mystery even to you, that you could not understand your emotions or health without the help of a man, a doctor, a priest, or a husband. This belief was everywhere. Even menstruation, a natural part of life, was seen as dangerous. Some medieval doctors said that menstrual blood was poisonous, that it could spoil wine, dull a mirror, or harm crops. Women were told that they must stay away from sacred objects during their cycle, that they should avoid physical labor, that their bodies were unclean. Pregnancy was also misunderstood. Most people did not know how it happened or why it sometimes failed. When a woman became pregnant, her husband got the credit. If she did not, she was often blamed. Miscarriages were seen as signs of sin, weakness, or even witchcraft. A woman who lost too many pregnancies might be shamed or accused of being cursed. And childbirth, while natural, was dangerous. Many women died giving birth. Others were left weak or injured. But even then, their pain was often seen as punishment, a reminder of Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. So what did all of this mean for control? It meant that men, especially doctors and priests, believed they had a right to speak for the female body, to decide what it meant, to choose how it should be treated. Women were told they could not be trusted to understand their own health. If they refused intimacy, they were sick. If they expressed desire, they were sinful. If they resisted control, they were mad. This control even extended into reproduction. Women were expected to have children. Many children. This was part of their duty as wives. Some religious leaders said that women who did not become pregnant had failed their role. And yet, if a woman tried to control when or whether she became pregnant, by using herbs or other methods, she could be accused of sorcery. Or worse, some herbal knowledge was passed down from mother to daughter. Quiet recipes for teas, powders, or charms that might help prevent pregnancy. But using them was dangerous. If caught, the woman might be punished by the church or the community. So once again, a woman's most personal choices were taken from her. Her body was studied, discussed, and judged, but rarely by her. Still, we find moments of quiet strength. Women who acted as midwives had special knowledge. They helped other women give birth. They offered advice. They created small circles of trust. Some midwives were respected. Others were feared. And as the centuries went on, many were accused of witchcraft. Not because of what they did wrong, but because they knew too much. So let's return to that physician's room. The books, the herbs, the sharp smell of oil and ink. A man writes down ideas about a body he does not have. A body he says is weaker, sicker, and more sinful. And yet, women live inside those bodies. They feel. They carry life. They heal. They are not mysteries. They are simply misunderstood. In the next segment, we will explore how ideas about purity, honor, and virginity were used as tools of control. Not just in marriage, but in every stage of a woman's life. We now walk into one of the quietest, most powerful spaces in a medieval woman's life, the idea of purity. This wasn't something you could see or touch, but it followed a girl from the moment she was born. It decided how others treated her. It affected whether she could marry, whether her family was respected, and even whether she was believed in court. Tonight, we're going to explore how virginity, purity, and honor were deeply tied together, and how these ideas helped medieval men maintain control over women, long before marriage and long after. Let's begin with a child. A girl of about 7, dressed in simple wool, helping her mother with chores. She does not know it yet, but her value in the eyes of her family is already being measured, not by her kindness or cleverness, but by the condition of her future body. In the medieval world, virginity was seen as a woman's most valuable possession. For noble families, it was a bargaining chip, a way to secure powerful marriages. For poorer families, it was often the only thing that stood between a daughter and ruin. A girl who lost her virginity outside of marriage was considered ruined. This didn't just affect her. It could stain the name of her entire family. And so families, especially fathers and older brothers, had a strong reason to protect this honor. This led to constant supervision. A young girl might not be left alone with male servants, apprentices, or even cousins. She might be forbidden from walking to the market alone, or from speaking with strangers. Her movements were watched. Her clothes were chosen. Her voice was silenced. And all of this was done to protect something invisible, the idea that she was pure. Let's pause here. Imagine being a young girl, full of questions and curiosity, and being told, again and again, to be silent, to be still, to be good. You do not understand why, but you begin to learn that your body is not entirely your own. Now let's look at how this idea became part of marriage. On the wedding night, a bride's virginity was expected. In many regions, this was not just a hope, it was a legal expectation. If a husband believed his bride was not a virgin, he could sometimes cancel the marriage. In rare and disturbing cases, families even displayed bloodied sheets the next morning to prove that the bride had been untouched. This turned the idea of purity into a performance, a public show, a piece of evidence. And if a woman could not provide this proof, the consequences were serious. She might be sent back to her father's house. She might be abandoned. She might be punished. All for something she could not fully control. Some women were born with physical differences. Others had accidents. Some were harmed. But the law and the culture rarely asked questions. If a woman was not intact, it was assumed to be her fault. Now think of how this affected women in every part of life. A widow who tried to remarry might be called impure. A poor woman who worked in someone's house might be assumed to be immoral. Even a healer or midwife could be accused of improper behavior. And once a woman's reputation was gone, it was nearly impossible to get it back. This system was not just cruel. It was confusing. Women were told to be modest, but also attractive. Silent, but also cheerful. Obedient, but also clever enough to run a home. If they were too bold, they were shamed. If they were too quiet, they were overlooked. Even their bodies were expected to reflect purity. Pale skin, soft hands, and a quiet voice were signs of innocence. But these were things only rich women could manage. Poor women, who worked in the sun and labored with their hands, were often assumed to be less pure, simply because of how they looked. So we see how class, gender, and power were tied together. Let's return now to the idea of honor. In the medieval world, a man's honor was often tied to the women in his family. If his daughter was seen as impure, he might lose respect. If his wife was accused of adultery, he might be mocked. This gave men a reason to control, and even punish, the women around them. In some regions, honor-based violence was accepted. A man who harmed a daughter or sister for shaming the family might be forgiven. The community might say he had no choice. These ideas were strongest in certain parts of Europe and the Mediterranean. But the fear of shame existed almost everywhere. Even stories and songs told girls to guard their purity like treasure. In tales of chivalry, the best women were gentle, quiet, and untouched. The worst were loud, clever, or independent. This shaped how girls saw themselves, and how boys learned to treat them. And yet, not all stories were the same. In some places, women found ways to push back. They joined religious orders, choosing purity on their own terms. Others ran away to avoid forced marriages. Some disguised themselves as men to live freely. These were rare cases, but they remind us that even in a world built to control, some women found paths of resistance. Let's end this segment by imagining a young girl, standing beside her mother, learning to weave linen by the window. She is still innocent in the eyes of her world, still untouched. But already, the weight of purity rests on her shoulders, quiet, invisible, and heavy. In the next segment, we will shift from women's private lives to the spaces where women had some power, the convents and religious houses where obedience took a different form, and where silence became strength. Convents and quiet resistance, when obedience became power. Let us now turn from the streets and homes to a very different kind of place. A world behind thick stone walls. A world of bells, candles, quiet gardens, and long halls filled with whispered prayers. We are entering the medieval convent. At first glance, this seems like another space of obedience. Nuns followed strict rules. They wore plain robes. They lived in silence, gave up wealth, and avoided the outside world. But within these quiet walls, many women found something surprising, a form of control. A kind of freedom that the world outside could not offer. Let's begin with a simple moment. A young girl around 13 sits in a cloister. The sunlight filters through arched windows. She holds a book in her hands. She reads slowly, mouthing the words in Latin. She is not married. She is not watched by a husband or judged by a village. She is, in a way, her own person, within the rules of her order. Convents offered a different path. In a world where most women were told to marry, bear children, and serve their husbands, the cloister offered a kind of escape. Of course, entering a convent was not always a free choice. In many noble families, younger daughters were sent to religious life because there were not enough dowries to marry them all off. Some were placed in convents as children, barely old enough to understand what it meant. But others chose it, and for some, it was the best of the limited options available. A woman in a convent could avoid marriage, childbirth, and the risks of a dangerous or controlling husband. She could live in the company of other women. She could study, teach, and sometimes write. And while nuns were expected to be obedient, their obedience was often to each other, not to a husband or father. Some convents became centers of learning. Nuns copied manuscripts, preserved texts, and even wrote their own works. In some regions, convents ran schools for girls, cared for the sick, or served as safe places for widows and unmarried women. One famous example is Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century nun from what is now Germany. She wrote music, books on medicine, and religious visions. She advised kings and bishops. She was a woman of faith, but also a woman of great influence. There was also Julian of Norwich, an English mystic who wrote one of the first books in English by a woman. Her gentle words still echo today. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. But life in the convent was not always peaceful. Rules were strict. Days began early with prayer and ended late in cold stone dormitories. Meals were simple. Conversation was limited. Physical comfort was rare. And yet, many women preferred this life to the risks outside. Let's imagine a noblewoman who had been widowed at a young age. Her family pressures her to remarry. But instead, she enters a convent. Here, she keeps control of her time, her thoughts, and even her money. She becomes the prioress, a leader in her community. She is respected. She is safe. And for once, her body is not someone else's concern. In this space, a woman could be educated. She could avoid gossip. She could spend her life serving others in ways she chose. Some convents became quite powerful. They owned land, collected rents, and managed resources. A strong abbess could act much like a lord, overseeing property and even judging minor disputes. Of course, this power came with boundaries. The church still expected nuns to obey male bishops and follow church teachings. Convents that became too wealthy or too independent were sometimes shut down or brought under tighter control. Still, The quiet strength of these women should not be overlooked. Let's take a moment now to picture a cloister garden, stone paths, herbs growing in neat rows, the sound of sandals brushing the gravel. A group of women walk in silence, their minds full of scripture, questions, or plans. They are not free in every sense, but they are free from certain expectations. No husband will demand their obedience. No law will force them into childbirth. No family will trade their bodies for land or gold. Here, in this walled place, they have carved out a different kind of life. Some women used the safety of the convent to speak more boldly. They wrote letters, gave spiritual advice, or challenged unjust practices. A few even defied the church itself, quietly, through words and ideas. Others simply lived in peace, far from the watching eyes of towns and villages. As we end this segment, let us pause in that garden. The bell rings for evening prayer. The nuns turn quietly and walk inside. The door closes behind them, shutting out the noise of the world. Inside there is silence, order, stillness, and in that stillness a small but powerful truth. Sometimes, in choosing obedience to one system, a woman could escape another. In the next segment, we will look at what happened when women were accused of breaking these rules, especially those who were seen as witches, rebels, or dangerous. Let's now turn toward the edge of the village, where fear and rumor grow like weeds. This is the space outside the usual path, where women who did not follow the rules were whispered about, watched closely, and sometimes punished in terrifying ways. Tonight, we speak of accusation, especially of women called witches, rebels, or unnatural. These were often not criminals. They were simply women who refused to obey or were believed to refuse. The system built to control them. Let's begin in a small town. A woman in her 40s lives alone. She is not married. She works as a healer, mixing herbs and whispering prayers passed down from her grandmother. When babies are born, she helps. When fevers come, she offers teas and broths. For years, she has been useful. But now, someone's cow has died. Another woman's child is sick. A few neighbors start to whisper. The healer becomes suspicious. This is how it often began, with bad luck, jealousy, or fear. In medieval and early modern Europe, being different could be dangerous. A woman who lived without a man. A woman who spoke too freely. A woman who owned land or knew medicine. Any of these things might lead to whispers of witchcraft. By the 14th and 15th centuries, accusations became more serious. The church and local courts began to link unusual behavior with heresy, the crime of going against religious teaching. Soon, witch trials became more common. Women were asked impossible questions. Did you consort with the devil? Did you fly in the night? Did you cause illness with your gaze? If they said no, they might be tortured until they said yes. If they said yes, they were condemned. And what defined a witch? Often, it had little to do with spells. Instead, it had everything to do with power. A woman who seemed too confident, too clever, or too independent could become a target. Especially if she had no husband to protect her. Especially if she was poor, old, or disliked. Let's pause here. Imagine a woman sitting in a dark, damp cell. She has no lawyer. She does not understand why she is there. She has lived quietly, raised children, and helped her neighbors. But now she is called a threat. Not because of what she's done, but because she does not fit. These accusations were not always about magic. They were about control. Calling a woman a witch gave others power over her. It silenced her voice. It ended arguments. It made fear into a weapon. And witchcraft was not the only accusation used to punish women who stepped out of line. Some women were labeled rebels, especially if they challenged their husbands, refused to marry, or spoke in public. A woman who argued in court could be mocked. A woman who shouted in the street might be called mad. In many towns, women who were loud or disrespectful could be punished with public shame. One example was the scold's bridle, a metal mask placed over a woman's face, with a small plate to press down on the tongue. She was paraded through the village, humiliated for using her voice. Another punishment was the ducking stool, a seat used to dunk women into cold water, again and again, as a warning to be quiet. These were not just rare events. They were public messages. Be obedient. Be silent. Or this could happen to you. Let's look at another kind of dangerous woman, the widow with property. If a woman's husband died and she inherited land or wealth, she could become powerful. Some widows managed farms, ran businesses, or acted as guardians for their children. But this power made some people uneasy. If she refused to remarry, they asked, "What is she hiding? If she made bold choices, they asked, who is guiding her? And if something went wrong, a bad harvest, a sick animal, the blame might fall on her. So, even when women did nothing wrong, their independence itself was seen as suspicious. Yet still, many women took risks. They challenged unfair laws. They spoke out in court. Some joined revolts or protested taxes. During times of crisis, women sometimes led food riots, throwing stones, blocking markets, and demanding lower prices. These were not wild criminals. They were mothers trying to feed their children, wives trying to survive, girls tired of being ignored. In France, Italy, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, records show women demanding justice, even when the system was stacked against them. Some succeeded. Others paid a terrible price. Let's now return to that healer at the edge of town. She has been accused. She stands before a judge. The crowd watches. Some believe her. Some are afraid. A few are glad to see her fall. And yet she stands. Quiet. Tired. Not evil, just alone. And different. This is what happens when women step outside their assigned roles. The system does not simply disagree. It fights back. As we close this segment, picture a quiet village square at night. The wind moves through the trees. The houses are still. But inside, fear grows, not of monsters, but of women who refuse to bow their heads. In the next segment, we'll shift our focus to noble women and queens, to see how women with power face their own forms of control, both in bed and beyond. We now leave the dusty village and step into a palace. You hear the soft creak of polished wood, the rustle of fine silk, the low murmur of voices behind thick stone walls. Here, behind the golden embroidery and glittering jewels, lived women with great titles, queens, duchesses, and noble ladies. But even for them, life was not free. Tonight, we look at the ways powerful women at the very top of society, were still controlled by the same ideas that shaped the lives of peasant wives and convent nuns. Let's begin with a question. What does it mean to be a queen when your body still belongs to someone else? In medieval Europe, royal women were born into duty. Their marriages were arranged when they were still children. Their names appeared on treaties. Their bodies were vessels for future kings. Let's imagine a princess at age 12. She sits quietly in a foreign palace, learning the language of her future husband. She is praised for being graceful, silent, obedient. These are her tools, not armies, not laws, but her stillness and her womb. Queens were expected to bear sons. That was their first, and sometimes only, role. A queen who gave birth to healthy boys was honored. A queen who had daughters, or no children at all, was whispered about, pitted, or even cast aside. Some were divorced. Others were accused of sin. A few were locked away. Take the example of Catherine of Aragon, who married England's Henry VIII. She was a learned, intelligent queen, but she failed to give him a living son. After years of loyalty, she was set aside, accused of being barren, stripped of her title, and forced to live out her days alone. Now imagine the pressure. Your body is not just yours. It is tied to the future of a dynasty. Every pregnancy becomes a matter of politics. Every miscarriage becomes a national crisis. And yet, despite this burden, queens had very little say over their own lives. Their homes, their movements, even their clothing was managed by male advisors. Royal bedrooms were not private. Courtiers and ladies-in-waiting reported on everything, from what the queen ate to how often she was with her husband. There were even rules about how queens should appear in public. They were to be modest, but not too plain. Gentle, but not weak. Noble, but never bold. And if they stepped beyond those limits, they were punished. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century. She was queen of both France and England. She led armies. She influenced culture. But when she pushed too far, supporting her sons in rebellion against their father, she was imprisoned by her husband, King Henry II, for more than 15 years. Even queens could be locked away. Now let's look at another famous figure, Isabella of France, sometimes called the She-Wolf of France. She was married to England's King Edward II, a ruler many believed was weak and distracted. Isabella led a rebellion against him, helped remove him from the throne, and ruled for a time as regent for her young son. But history remembered her harshly. She was called wicked, unnatural, dangerous, not because she failed, but because she dared to lead. This pattern appears again and again. Powerful women were accepted, as long as they stayed within certain limits. Once they stepped beyond, once they made decisions on their own, they were seen as threats. Even love and intimacy could become tools of control. Some queens were married to men they despised, yet forced to share a bed in order to keep the peace. Others were accused of adultery as a way to weaken their power, whether or not they had done anything wrong. In the French court, Marguerite of Burgundy was imprisoned and possibly murdered after being accused of being unfaithful to the king. Her supposed lovers were tortured and executed in public. No evidence was needed. Rumors were enough. Queens lived in palaces, but their lives were often lonely. They were surrounded by walls, real and invisible. Their thoughts were not private. Their actions were recorded. Some found quiet ways to resist. They wrote letters, formed alliances, influenced their sons or husbands behind the scenes. Others played the long game, smiling in public, plotting in private. Some became patrons of writers, artists, and churches. They supported learning, founded convents, or protected scholars. In these ways, they left a mark that could not be easily erased. Let's return now to the royal bedchamber. The curtains are drawn. The fire flickers softly. A young queen lies awake, listening to the footsteps of servants outside her door. She wears a crown. Her name is known across kingdoms. But still she is watched, judged, owned. Her worth is measured not by her mind, but by her womb. Her silence, her obedience. And still, in the quiet, she dreams of more. In the next segment, we will shift our attention to the written word, exploring medieval love letters, guides for wives, and what they reveal about how women were expected to behave in private and in bed. Let us now leave behind the royal courts and step into a quieter place. A writing desk by candlelight. The room smells of beeswax and ink. There is a creak in the wooden floor and the soft rustle of parchment being unrolled. Here, someone is writing advice, or perhaps copying it from a book. This is where we begin our next story, with words on a page. Words that tried to shape how women lived, how they loved, and how they behaved in the bedroom. In the medieval world, books and letters were powerful tools. They didn't just share news or poetry. They were used to teach people how to behave. And for women, the messages were often the same: be quiet, be pure, be obedient. Let's begin with a book that was copied and shared across Europe. It was called Le Ménager de Paris, or The Goodman of Paris. Written around the year 1393, this book was a guide from an older husband to his very young wife. It was full of advice on how to cook, how to keep a house, how to pray, and how to behave in the bedroom. The husband wrote that a wife should be like wax, soft, ready to take the shape her husband gave her. He told her not to contradict her husband, even if she thought he was wrong. He said she should serve him cheerfully, accept his moods, and be ready to meet his needs, especially at night. And he reminded her that God had made her to be under the rule of her husband. Now imagine being that young wife. Perhaps she is only 14 or 15. She reads these pages, or has them read to her. She is told her body belongs to her husband now. That refusing him is a sin. That saying no is not an option. This book was not unique. Many similar texts were written during the medieval and early modern periods. Some were written by priests, others by noblemen. Some were written by women who had been taught these ideas themselves. They often included lines like, "A good wife should be like a mirror, reflecting her husband's will. A silent woman is a gift from the Lord. A woman must never instruct a man, nor correct him, nor question his desires." Even love letters carried this tone. At first glance, they seem romantic. A man might write to his beloved with flattery and longing. He would call her gentle, sweet, graceful. But underneath the sweetness, there was often a message. She was to be his, to belong, to submit. Some letters included warnings. If the woman delayed too long, she might lose his favor. If she did not return his feelings, she might be shamed. In some cases, these letters were not written for love at all. They were written to convince, to pressure, or to seduce. Words were used as tools, to gain access to her time, her body, her obedience. And women were not always given a chance to respond. Even in marriage, letters could become reminders of duty. Husbands who traveled sent notes reminding their wives to remain loyal, to pray, and to be ready for their return. Some men even left behind written instructions on how their wives should behave while they were gone, including how often to pray, what to wear, and what to allow in the marriage bed. Let's pause and imagine one of these women. She sits by the hearth, reading a letter written in careful script. It is signed by her husband, who is off at war. He reminds her that she belongs to him, that her thoughts, her body, and her days should follow his rules. She sighs. She folds the letter. She puts it away. This is not love as we might think of it today. It is more like management, like ownership written in ink. Even poetry reinforced these ideas. Medieval songs often praised women for being cold, distant, and hard to win. Once they gave in, the song usually ended. Desire was only beautiful when the woman resisted, gently, quietly, playfully. Once she belonged to a man, the interest faded. Women were praised not for what they wanted, but for how well they obeyed. There were exceptions. Some women wrote their own letters, full of longing, frustration, or wit. A few noble women wrote poetry that hinted at freedom, at passion, at secret love. But these voices were rare, and often hidden. The message most women heard was clear. Love was not about equal partnership. It was about obedience wrapped in sweet words. Even religious writing supported this idea. Priests wrote that the wife's body belonged to her husband, just as his body belonged to Christ. Any refusal of duty, physical or emotional, was seen as sinful. And this was not just theory. In some regions, husbands could go to court if their wives refused intimacy. They could demand compliance, backed by law and scripture. Let's end this segment with the image of a woman alone in a small chamber. The candle burns low. She picks up a book, The Goodman of Paris, perhaps. She reads the lines about obedience, about silence, about duty. She closes the book. She stares at the flame. She is not angry. She is not defiant. But she feels the quiet weight of expectation pressing down. In the next segment, we will explore the idea of romantic love itself, and how courtship and affection were often shaped by power, performance, and control. We now enter the gardens of courtly love, a place of soft poetry, fluttering banners, and whispered songs. Here, love appears beautiful. Knights kneel before ladies. Poems are written under moonlight. Flowers are given with trembling hands. But if we look more closely, we see something else beneath the roses and rhymes. A quiet form of control dressed up as romance. Tonight, we explore how courtship, affection, and even so-called love often masked deep inequalities between men and women in the medieval world. Let us begin with a popular idea from the 12th and 13th centuries, courtly love. In this tradition, a knight devoted himself to a lady. He promised to serve her with loyalty. He might wear her colors in battle. He might write her poems. He would say she was his sovereign, his goddess, even his reason for living. On the surface, this seems like a kind of power for women. But courtly love was not equal. The lady was placed on a pedestal, admired, idealized, but never truly known. She was expected to be pure, distant, and passive. Her value came from her beauty and her silence. And the knight's affection was not always gentle. In many stories, the woman is won through pressure, persistence, or public praise that leaves her no choice but to respond. She becomes a prize. Her consent, when it appears at all, is usually quiet. A blush, a lowered gaze, a whispered yes. Sometimes even that is missing. In some tales, knights force kisses or touches upon women who do not resist strongly enough. These moments were not written as violent, but as passionate, as proof of desire. This teaches us something important, that in medieval love stories, a woman's refusal was often not taken seriously. In real life, the pattern continued. A man might court a woman with gifts, songs, and visits. If she said no, he might try again. And again. Society often admired this, calling it loyalty or devotion. But from the woman's view, it was pressure. It was insistence wrapped in flattery. Let's imagine a village girl. A local merchant's son takes interest in her. He brings her small gifts, a ribbon, a piece of honeycomb. He writes her awkward poems. He waits outside her door. If she accepts him, she is praised. If she refuses, she is mocked. If she refuses too strongly, she might be called cold, proud, or unnatural. So many women learned to be polite, to smile, to delay. Not because they wanted to play games, but because it was the safest way to say no. Now let's shift to noble courtships. Here, matches were usually arranged. A girl of 13 or 14 might be promised to a man in his 30s or 40s. She might not meet him until the wedding. Her father signed the papers. Her dowry was prepared. Her opinion was not required. Even when romance was added, a poem, a gift, a letter, the power still rested with the man. Some women tried to resist. A few refused to marry. Others escaped their families and joined convents instead. But most followed the path laid out for them, with no real choice in who they loved or how they lived. And even when love did bloom between two people, it existed within a world where the man held legal and physical authority. In marriage, A woman could not own her property without permission. She could not refuse her husband's touch without risk. Her letters could be read, her movements monitored. So even love, in its softest form, was shaped by the laws of power. Let's look now at another side of romance, the use of love to control. Some men used affection to keep women in line. A husband might say, "I do this because I love you," before restricting where his wife went or who she saw. Fathers might keep daughters unmarried for years, using their love to justify keeping them at home. Even the church spoke of love as a reason for obedience. Priests said that a wife should submit not just out of duty, but out of affection, that true love meant yielding without complaint. Let's pause. Imagine a young woman reading a letter from her husband. It says, "My love for you is deep, which is why I correct you when you stray." She is told that love includes control, that his guidance is kindness. So she tries harder. She keeps quieter. She learns to smile when she feels sadness. This was not abuse in the loud, violent way, but it was a quiet training, shaping women into what men believed they should be. And still, in the shadows of this system, women found ways to feel. They formed deep friendships with other women. They whispered about their thoughts and hopes. Some wrote poems or songs in secret. Others passed down stories of clever wives and strong daughters. Love, after all, is not something that can be completely controlled. It finds cracks in the wall. But the shape of love in the medieval world was narrow. Women were expected to be grateful for the attention they received, no matter how one-sided it was. They were told that the right man would know best, that their desires should follow, not lead. Let's end this segment with the image of a woman sitting in a garden, reading a love poem written in careful script. The words are soft and sweet, but they carry an edge, a reminder that even love, in this world, is a kind of command. In the next segment, we will turn to medieval laws, and see how control was not only personal, but written into the very systems of justice, property, and family. The law was his, how legal systems controlled women's bodies. We now leave the gardens of love and enter the colder, quieter halls of power. Heavy doors creak open. Parchment rustles. A man with a robe and ink-stained fingers leans over a wooden bench. He is writing laws, and those laws do not belong to women. Tonight, we enter the legal world of the medieval period, where rules and customs made male control not just expected, but official, written, signed, and sealed. These were not whispers or private punishments. These were decisions made in public that affected every part of a woman's life. Let's begin with one simple truth. A woman, in the eyes of the law, was not fully her own person. She belonged to her father, then to her husband, then to her son or male relative if widowed. The law, across most of Europe, reflected this idea. In England, under a system called coverture, a married woman had no separate legal identity. Her husband represented her in court. He controlled her income, her land, her debts, and even her body. She could not sign contracts alone. She could not sue or be sued. She could not own property unless her husband allowed it. She could be punished for disobedience, but she could not defend herself without him. Even if her husband was cruel or unfaithful or dangerous, the law usually stood with him. A woman who tried to leave her husband had few rights. Divorce, where allowed, was rare and difficult, and almost always favored the man. Let's pause here. Imagine a woman whose husband spends their money, strikes her when angry, and takes other lovers. She tries to seek help. The local priest tells her to be patient. The court refuses to hear her case. Her neighbors say, "That's just how it is." She returns home silent. The law made obedience safer than resistance. Let's turn to the matter of marriage. Most regions did not require a woman's full consent. A father could arrange his daughter's marriage, especially if she was young or of noble birth. In many places, girls as young as 12 could be legally married. If she cried or refused, it didn't always matter. If the marriage was completed, meaning the couple lived together or consummated the union, the law considered it valid. A forced marriage could be challenged in theory, but very few women succeeded. Once married, the woman's body was assumed to be available to her husband. Refusing intimacy was often seen as a form of disobedience. In some areas, a husband could take legal action if his wife refused him. This might include public punishment or religious correction. The law did not call this abuse. It called it order. Even crimes against women were shaped by this system. If a woman was assaulted, the court might ask, was she married? Was she pure? Was she silent or loud? Did she scream? Was she walking alone? The case was not just about the act, but about her behavior. If the woman was seen as impure or untrustworthy, the law might ignore her. Not for the harm done to the woman, but for the violation of another man's property. Let's pause and think about that. If a woman was unmarried, her father could demand compensation. If she was married, it was her husband's right to be angry, not hers. The injury was considered his, not hers. This reveals the quiet truth behind many medieval laws. Women were treated less as individuals and more as possessions. They could be valued, protected, even cherished, but rarely did they own themselves in the eyes of the law. Let's turn now to property and inheritance. In most parts of Europe, inheritance passed through the male line. Sons received land, titles, wealth. Daughters might receive dowries, gifts or money to take into marriage, but rarely kept the land itself. There were exceptions. In some regions of Spain and Italy, daughters could inherit equally. In parts of France, noble women controlled large estates when no sons remained. But even then, these women were usually expected to remarry, transferring that power back into male hands. And a widow's rights were never guaranteed. Imagine a woman who had helped manage her husband's estate for 20 years. She knew every tenant's name, every line of the account books. But when her husband died, his brothers appeared. The law said the estate belonged to the male line. She was given a small allowance and asked to leave. She had managed everything, yet was treated as if she had no claim. In many towns, guilds excluded women from full membership. A woman might work alongside her husband in his shop. She might keep the books, train apprentices, and craft fine goods. But her name would not appear on the official records. Her work was hidden behind his. In law, she was an assistant. In reality, she was a partner, without credit, pay, or legal recognition. Even in the church courts, where spiritual matters were judged, women had limited voices. If a woman wanted to bring a case, perhaps against a cheating or abusive husband, she needed male witnesses. She needed to behave in ways the court deemed respectable. And she often had to wait months, even years, for a decision. Meanwhile, her husband might be free to remarry, travel, or simply ignore the ruling. Now let's look at punishment. The law was often harsher on women who broke gender expectations. A woman who committed adultery was more likely to be punished than a man. A woman who dressed like a man could be fined or whipped. A woman who raised her voice in court might be silenced or removed. And women accused of crimes had to work harder to prove innocence. One harsh example is the ordeal, a legal test used in early medieval courts. A woman accused of lying might be forced to carry hot iron or plunge her hands into boiling water. If her wounds healed quickly, God had proven her innocence. If not, she was guilty. These ordeals were terrifying, and though they faded over time, they remind us of a legal world built on pain, silence, and power. Even women of noble birth could not escape. If a queen was suspected of infidelity or rebellion, she might be imprisoned without trial. Her letters might be read aloud in court. Her children might be taken from her. Control by law extended into the very heart of families. Now let's pause and picture a woman standing in a dusty town hall. Her hands are clasped tightly. She speaks carefully, hoping the scribe writes her words honestly. Behind her stand three men, her uncle, the local priest, and the man who claims she owes him rent. She looks at the judge. She has no lawyer, no vote, no real right to speak freely. She hopes for fairness, but she does not expect it. And still she speaks. Calmly, clearly, bravely, because even in a world shaped by law and tradition, women found ways to push back. Sometimes through the courts, sometimes outside of them. Some learned the law better than the men who used it against them. Others used loopholes, hiding property, arranging secret marriages, or finding sympathetic judges. A few women became legal scholars, advisors, or even judges in religious courts. But these were rare exceptions, glimmers of possibility in a system designed to keep power in male hands. Let us end this segment by imagining that same woman, walking home at dusk. Her case is still undecided, her future uncertain, but for a moment she feels strong. Not because the law is fair, but because she dared to speak inside it. In the next segment, we will explore the daily reality of women's health, fertility, and childbirth, and how control over women's bodies continued through midwives, medicine, and fear. Now we enter a quieter, more hidden world, the world of women's health, fertility, and childbirth in the Middle Ages. A space behind closed doors, where the air is thick with the scent of herbs and sweat, where women gather, whisper, and wait, where pain is common, but silence is expected. Tonight, We explore how control over women's bodies did not end with marriage or law. It continued in childbirth, in medicine, and in beliefs about fertility, where the body was treated as both sacred and suspicious. Let's begin in a darkened chamber, where a woman is in labor. Her face is pale. Her hands grip the sheets. Around her stand women, midwives, relatives, servants. The men are outside, waiting. The priest has been called, just in case. This is a moment of great risk. For medieval women, childbirth was one of the most dangerous things they would ever do. No matter her wealth or rank, a woman could die giving birth. Infection, blood loss, or a baby turned the wrong way. All could bring death within hours. And yet, she had little say in whether she would bear children. Once married, it was expected. It was her duty. Refusing was rarely an option. In fact, many believed that a woman's body existed for childbirth, that her health, her mind, even her soul were shaped by her ability to conceive. If she failed to become pregnant, she was blamed. If she had too many children and grew weak, she was pitied but not spared. And if she miscarried, she might be accused of sin or witchcraft. Let's pause and consider that weight. A woman's value was often tied to something she could not fully control, her womb. Now let's look at the midwife, a central figure in medieval women's health. She was usually an older woman, trained through experience, not books. She knew how to turn a baby inside the womb, how to ease a fever, how to cut the cord and tie it tight. She also knew prayers, charms, and herbs. She was both healer and comforter, often working in secret. But midwives walked a narrow path. If a birth went wrong, they could be blamed. If a baby was stillborn, they might be accused of evil. If a woman died, the midwife's name might be whispered in fear. Some were praised for their skill. Others were punished for their failures, or simply for being women with knowledge. There were few formal medical schools for women. Most medical books were written by men, and they often misunderstood the female body. Some said a woman's womb wandered through her body when she was emotional. Others claimed too much education would make her infertile. Doctors wrote that women were naturally cold and moist, and therefore weaker. They believed a man's body was complete, while a woman's was flawed, a less perfect version. These ideas shaped how women were treated. A woman in pain might be told it was her imagination. A woman with swelling or bleeding might be treated with prayers instead of care. A woman who could not bear children might be cast out or replaced. Yet, despite this, women still found ways to care for each other. They shared remedies: sage for bleeding, honey for wounds, pennyroyal for unwanted pregnancy. They sang to each other during labor. They held hands. They wept together when the child did not cry. They created spaces where they were heard, even if only in whispers. Let's return now to that chamber. The woman has given birth. The baby is alive, but the mother is weak. She is wrapped in warm cloth. Broth is brought. A prayer is said. The midwife nods once, then quietly gathers her tools. Another birth survived, but only just. For noble women, childbirth was still dangerous, but it was also public. Servants watched. Courtiers waited. The birth of a son meant celebration. The birth of a daughter meant silence. The queen's health was a matter of national concern, not for her own sake, but for the dynasty. Some queens were forced to give birth in full view of witnesses, to prevent rumors of swapped babies. These were not private, peaceful moments. They were performances, loaded with pressure and risk. Let's imagine a noblewoman, in her 15th year of marriage. She has buried 3 children already. Her body is tired. Her back aches. She lies in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the next labor. No one asks if she wants another child. The church teaches it is her purpose. The law says her husband decides. Her body is not truly hers. It is a vessel, a duty, a hope. And still, in secret, she might whisper to her maid about a certain herb. Or she might visit a healer in the village. These were quiet forms of resistance, small choices made in a world where choice was rarely allowed. Let's end this segment by imagining a midwife walking home through a dark village street. Her bag is light now. Her hands are stained. Behind her, a new life cries in the distance. She has no title, no wealth, but she carries generations of knowledge passed from woman to woman. In the next segment, we will explore how some women used religious devotion, not just for peace or prayer, but as a way to escape control, build community, and claim a different kind of life. The cloistered path, religion as refuge and control. Let us now enter a place of stone and silence, a medieval convent. The air is still. The candles burn low. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimes softly, marking the passing of another quiet hour. Here, behind high walls and heavy doors, lived women who had stepped away from the path of marriage and motherhood. Nuns, sisters, and anchoresses. Some came willingly. Others were placed here by fathers or brothers. All lived under strict rules, and yet, for many, the convent offered a rare kind of freedom. Tonight, we explore how religious life both freed and controlled women in the Middle Ages. How devotion could be both a prison and a refuge. Let's begin with a young girl, perhaps 13 or 14. Her family is noble but not wealthy. They cannot afford a large dowry to marry her off. Instead, they offer her to the church. She is sent to a convent, a gift to God, they say, a way to protect her, to save her soul, and to spare her family the cost of another wedding. She does not choose this life. But once inside, her path is sealed. She receives a new name, a new identity. She is no longer her father's daughter. She is the bride of Christ. The convent becomes her world. Inside these walls, women follow a strict daily rhythm: prayer, study, silence, work. Meals are eaten in silence. Speech is often limited. Clothing is plain. Hair is hidden. Individuality fades. And yet, for many women, this world also offers something unusual: time, learning, and peace. Unlike most women in the outside world, nuns are often taught to read and write. Some learn Latin. Some copy manuscripts or write their own. They read scripture, compose music, keep records, and run estates. For the educated few, a convent is one of the only places where a woman can live a life of the mind. Let's imagine a nun seated by a window. She dips her pen in ink and begins to write. Not a letter, but a book, her thoughts, her prayers, her visions. Her words may survive centuries, while her name is forgotten. Some convents became centers of learning. Some ran hospitals. Some supported the poor. A few were led by powerful abbesses who had influence in politics, money, and religion. But this power came with rules. Women in religious life were expected to be obedient, not to husbands, but to superiors and to church teachings. They lived under the rule, often the rule of Saint Benedict, which demanded humility, silence, and complete devotion. Disobedience could bring punishment: fasting, public confession, or removal from the community. And while some women chose this life freely, others were forced. In noble families, it was common to send one daughter to the convent, especially if there were too many children and too little money. Some girls were promised to monasteries as infants. Others were sent away after refusing a marriage. These women might live out their days behind walls they did not choose. Let's pause and think of one such woman. She wakes each day before dawn. She sings prayers in a cold chapel. She washes laundry in silence. She sleeps on a hard bench in a shared dormitory. She does not complain. But in the quiet, she remembers the garden at her home, her sister's wedding, the scent of her mother's hands. This is her life now, not of sin, but of stillness. And still, some nuns pushed the boundaries. They wrote boldly. They described visions of God as light, fire, or even a lover. They debated scripture. They led communities. One famous example is Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess who wrote music, medicine, and theology. She advised popes and emperors. She saw visions and wrote them down. She was respected, but also questioned. A woman with ideas was always a little dangerous. Others found subtler ways to resist. They created art in margins of manuscripts: rabbits with swords, snails fighting knights, women holding books. These playful images hinted at humor, imagination, and sometimes frustration. Some nuns wrote love poetry. Others kept secret letters. A few even escaped their convents, running away to be with lovers or to reclaim lives they had been denied. Not all convents were peaceful. Some were strict to the point of cruelty. Food was poor. Rooms were cold. Medical care was limited. Rules were enforced by fear. Women who spoke out were silenced. There were also anchor holds, small cells where women chose to be locked away, living in isolation, praying without ceasing. Some did this out of deep faith. Others were placed there for safety or punishment. Their meals were passed through small openings. They spoke through slits in the wall. Their entire world was one room. To modern minds, this seems extreme. But in a world where marriage brought constant childbirth and little rest, some women saw spiritual confinement as a form of peace, a way to live without the fear of being touched or controlled. Let's return now to our quiet convent. The sun is setting. The bell rings again. A line of women moves slowly through the cloister, their voices blending into a low hum. They are not queens. They are not mothers. But they are not entirely powerless. In this life of prayer and order, they have created a world of their own, not free, but different. A world where a woman's voice might be heard, even if only in song. In the next segment, we will step outside again, to the streets, the markets, the fields, and look at working women. How they earned, how they lived, and how their labor was shaped by the men around them. We now step out of the cloister and into the heartbeat of a medieval town. Down narrow streets packed with carts and voices, past bakeries and blacksmiths, across muddy courtyards where chickens scratch at the ground. Here, in the everyday rhythm of life, we find working women, weaving, cooking, brewing, spinning, selling, serving, raising children, and carrying loads too heavy for one back. This was the reality for most medieval women. Not queens, not nuns, not noble ladies, just ordinary women trying to survive. Tonight, we will look at the world of labor and how work became yet another place where men tried to control women's time, value, and freedom. Let's begin with the home, which was not a place of rest. It was a workplace. A wife woke before dawn. She stoked the fire, fetched water, ground grain, fed animals, tended children, made butter, cut herbs, patched clothes, mended tools, and maybe helped her husband with his trade. She did not clock out. There were no days off. Her work was unpaid, unseen, and expected. If she failed, she was shamed. If she succeeded, no one praised her. That was simply her duty. Now imagine a village woman with a small garden plot. She grows onions, beans, and leeks. She brews ale to sell at the market. She carries baskets on her back. But when tax time comes, her labor is counted as her husband's. Her earnings are his. In many towns, women could not officially own stalls, join guilds, or train apprentices unless a male relative vouched for them. Some got around this by calling themselves widows, even if their husbands were alive. Others worked under male names or through quiet partnerships. In large cities, women spun wool, made candles, sold herbs, embroidered garments, and worked as servants in large homes. Some ran inns or small shops. A few were scribes, midwives, or healers. But in nearly every case, they were paid less, respected less, trusted less. Let's pause and imagine a woman who makes lace. She works with her hands for 10 hours a day. Her eyes ache. Her shoulders hurt. She takes her finished work to market, but the buyer, a man, offers her half of what it's worth. She takes it. She has no choice. Even when women worked alongside their husbands, running bakeries or weaving cloth, the law usually credited the man. His name went on the records. His guild collected the dues. His decisions ruled the shop. A wife might manage the books, train workers, and even make key choices, but officially, she was invisible. Now let's look at servants and laborers, many of whom started working as children. Girls as young as 8 were sent into other households to work as maids, cooks, or nursemaids. They washed floors, fetched wood, helped with laundry, or tended the animals. Some lived with kind families. Others faced constant demands, poor food, and worse. These young girls were especially vulnerable to abuse, overworked, underfed, and often silenced if they complained. In fields and farms, women worked beside men, especially during harvest. They reaped grain, gathered hay, milked cows, and tended sheep. But when records were made, their names were often missing. Or they were listed simply as wife, daughter, or maid. Even in crafts and trades, women's work was often hidden. If a woman brewed ale, she might be called an alewife, a title that, over time, became associated with disorder and gossip. If she sold herbs or healed wounds, she might be accused of witchcraft. Women's skill was always under suspicion. Still, many fought for a place. In parts of Italy and France, some women worked as silk weavers, dyers, or glass painters. In Flanders, widows continued their husbands' cloth businesses. In England, women helped shape the booming wool trade. A few formed unofficial guilds, helped each other, and trained girls. Their work was essential, but their rights were fragile. Now let's turn to the night workers, women who served in taverns, bathhouses, or the streets. Some were labeled immoral. Others were simply poor, with no other choices. In many towns, sex work was tolerated but heavily controlled. Authorities taxed it. Priests preached against it. Men used it, and women bore the risk. Some were protected by brothel owners. Others were thrown out when they aged or fell ill. Few had savings. Fewer had safety. It was another world of work, shaped by power and silence. Let's pause and imagine one such woman, walking home in the early morning. The town is quiet now. Her shift is over. She carries her shoes in her hand to keep from waking the neighbors. She is tired. She is invisible. But she has earned a few coins. Enough for food. Enough for rent. The world judges her. But she is surviving. There were no labor laws. No protection. No unions. And yet, these women formed quiet networks, sharing bread, offering shelter, watching each other's children. Women who worked stood shoulder to shoulder, not always free, but never alone. Let's end this segment with a final image. A young woman at the loom, weaving a tapestry with steady hands. The pattern is slow, simple, repetitive. No one will remember her name, but her work will hang in the manor hall for generations. In the next segment, we will look at how knowledge, especially medical, magical, and spiritual, became one of the most contested spaces for women, and how what they knew often frightened the men around them. Let us now enter a different kind of room, one lined with shelves, filled with the scent of dried herbs, worn parchment, and candle wax. In this space, knowledge is gathered, shared, and whispered. A woman grinds roots with a stone. She recites names of plants under her breath. She ties bundles with care. She has no degree, no title, no permission from the church. But people come to her. For healing, for advice, for help. This is the space where women held knowledge, and where that knowledge often brought fear. Tonight, we explore how women's roles as healers, midwives, herbalists, and spiritual guides gave them quiet power, and how that power was challenged, feared, and sometimes violently taken away. Let's begin with medical knowledge, which, in the early medieval world, was often passed from woman to woman. Before the rise of university-trained physicians, who were almost all male, women were the doctors of their households and villages. They knew which leaves soothed fever, which oils eased labor pains, which poultices drew infection from a wound. They knew how to set bones, treat burns, and slow bleeding after childbirth. This was practical, hands-on knowledge. It came from observation, trial and error, and careful memory. Women learned it from mothers, grandmothers, or older neighbors. It was not written in Latin. It was lived. But as male physicians began to claim authority, especially in the later Middle Ages, this female knowledge was increasingly seen as unofficial, suspicious, or even dangerous. Let's pause and imagine a healer named Agnes. She has spent 30 years treating the sick in her town. One day, a young male physician arrives. He has books, robes, and papers. He questions her methods. He dismisses her knowledge. He tells others she is untrained. Soon, people whisper that Agnes is not just a healer, she is a witch. This happened often. As men gained access to universities and formal medicine, they began to push women out of healing. Laws were passed in many cities that banned unlicensed healers. And since women couldn't attend universities, they couldn't get licenses. Suddenly, their healing, once respected, was redefined as illegal. Midwives were especially vulnerable. Though essential to childbirth, they were now seen as possible threats. If a baby died, suspicion fell on the midwife. If she used prayers or charms, she might be accused of mixing religion with magic. Many church officials believed women were too emotional, too weak, or too curious to be trusted with sacred knowledge. In their view, Eve had brought sin into the world, and women who read too much, learned too much, or questioned too much might follow the same path. So, some women began to hide what they knew. They used coded language, passed recipes in secret, shared treatments only with trusted others. Their knowledge became quiet knowledge, always useful, always needed, but always at risk. Now let's turn to spiritual knowledge. Some women became mystics, having visions, writing prayers, hearing what they believed were the voices of angels or God. These women were both celebrated and feared. If their visions matched church teachings, they were praised as holy. If they questioned authority or claimed too much wisdom, they were silenced. Women like Marjorie Kemp in England, a deeply religious woman who spoke openly about her conversations with God, were mocked, investigated, or punished. Another, Julian of Norwich, lived as an anchoress, sealed in a small room beside a church. She wrote quietly about divine love and hope. Her words survived, but her face and voice are lost to time. These women lived carefully. They expressed their ideas through metaphors and prayer. But they were still pushing boundaries, claiming that God could speak through a woman. And that, to many men, was deeply uncomfortable. In some regions, women who combined healing and spiritual advice were accused of witchcraft. This word changed over time. In the early Middle Ages, it was rare. But by the late 1400s, it became a powerful label. Authorities began to link female knowledge with the devil. Books like the Malleus Maleficarum, or hammer of witches, taught that women were more likely than men to become witches. Why? Because they were weaker, more emotional, and more carnal. It was not really about magic. It was about control. A woman who spoke too freely, who refused marriage, who practiced healing without permission, she could be accused. Punishments ranged from public shame to prison or even death. Sometimes the accusations came from neighbors, sometimes from priests, sometimes from powerful men whose authority felt threatened. Let's pause and picture a village woman named Mira. She grows rosemary, treats fevers, and helps women with difficult births. One winter, a local child dies of illness. Mira is blamed. She is called before the town elders. She cannot read Latin. She cannot prove her innocence. She is no longer a healer. She is now a suspect. And yet, despite all this, women continued to learn. They remembered old remedies. They passed down songs and recipes. They hid books under floorboards. They taught daughters what their mothers had taught them. Their knowledge endured, not because it was written in grand libraries, but because it was whispered in kitchens, murmured in gardens, and stitched into daily life. Let's end this segment with a quiet moment. A woman bent over a wooden table, drying herbs in the sunlight. She does not call herself a scholar. She does not wear robes. But in her hands are generations of survival, knowledge not forgotten, but quietly alive. In the next segment, we will explore how some women rebelled against these systems, through stories, small resistances, and occasional acts of bold defiance. Quiet rebellions, small acts of defiance in a man's world. Let us now step into the soft, in-between spaces of medieval life, places where rules could be bent, where silence became a shield, and where women, though surrounded by limits, found ways to push back. Tonight, we explore how resistance did not always look like fire or battle. Sometimes it looked like a sideways glance, a withheld answer, a secret meeting, a story passed in whispers. These were the quiet rebellions of medieval women, calm, clever, and deeply human. Let's begin with the power of stories. In homes, in taverns, around fires, women told tales. Sometimes they were simple, about saints, animals, or tricksters. But others carried deeper messages. There were stories of clever wives who outsmarted cruel husbands, of girls who escaped forced marriages by pretending to be mad, of queens who ruled behind the throne, giving advice disguised as gossip. These tales were not shouted. They were passed from one woman to another, changing with each voice. They offered comfort, warning, and sometimes hope. Imagine a laundress, scrubbing clothes in a stream. She leans close to her friend and says, "Have you heard the tale of Lady Brielle, who switched places with her maid to avoid her wedding?" The other woman laughs. Maybe the story is true. Maybe not. But in the telling, something powerful is shared. The idea that control can be challenged, even if only in fiction. Now let's look at acts of delay and avoidance. A girl might agree to a marriage, but only after a long engagement. A wife might promise obedience, then quietly ignore her husband's less urgent commands. A servant might pretend to forget an errand that led her into danger. These were small things, easy to miss. But together they formed a pattern of choosing when possible, of slowing the pace of control. Sometimes resistance was as simple as waiting, refusing to act, knowing that silence can be stronger than argument. There were also women who refused to marry at all. Some joined convents. Others became beguines, religious women who lived together in communities without taking full vows. They prayed, taught, and worked, but did not bind themselves to church or man. This was dangerous in its own way. Women who lived outside traditional paths were often viewed with suspicion. Were they holy, or were they hiding something? But for many, the risk was worth it. They claimed space in a world that gave them none. Let's turn now to clothing, which could also be used as rebellion. The church and law both dictated what women should wear. Head coverings for modesty, long skirts for humility, simple fabrics for purity. But some women pushed back. They wore colors too bright, veils too sheer, bodices too tight. In towns, laws were passed to punish these choices, called sumptuary laws. Yet women still dressed how they pleased, even when they couldn't afford the fine. Sometimes wearing red when told to wear gray was a kind of protest, a way to say, "I choose myself, not just your rules." There were even legal rebels, women who challenged laws, sued husbands, or defended themselves in court. In Italy, a woman named Bettina argued that she should inherit her father's workshop. In England, Agnes appealed to keep her dowry after a cruel marriage. In France, Jean faced accusations of heresy and wrote her own defense. These cases were rare, and most failed. But their very existence shows that not all women accepted their fate quietly. And sometimes rebellion took the form of writing. A few women left behind poems, letters, and memoirs that challenged expectations. A woman named Christine de Pizan, writing in the early 1400s, composed books defending women's intelligence and goodness. She wrote, "If it were customary to send little girls to school, they would learn as well as the boys." Her words were bold, calm, and public. Christine did not shout. She reasoned. She built a tower of ideas and called it the City of Ladies. And within its imaginary walls, women could be wise, strong, and free. There were other rebels too, not in books but in behavior. A widow who refused to remarry, even when pressured. A girl who ran away and changed her name. A servant who fell in love with someone forbidden. Each made a small, personal choice in a world where choice was rare. Let's pause and imagine a young woman kneeling by her bed. Her family wants her to marry. She doesn't want to. She has no power to say no outright. But she prays. She weeps. She waits. In her own way, she resists. And sometimes that was all a woman could do. Stand still when everything pushed her forward. In the records of history, these women are hard to find. They were not warriors. They left no monuments. But they whispered to one another, shaped their lives carefully, and refused to vanish. Let's end this segment by picturing a group of women at dusk, sharing bread, laughter, and stories. They know the rules. They know the risks. But for a little while, they are simply themselves, unjudged, unowned, and unafraid. In the next segment, we will turn to the world of punishment. How women were controlled not just through laws or religion, but through public shame, symbolic rituals, and the constant threat of humiliation. Now we move into a more unsettling space, a public square filled with people. There is noise, laughter, sometimes jeering. In the center stands a woman. She is not bleeding or bound, but she is on display. Her hair may be cut, her clothes torn. Around her neck might hang a sign describing her crime. This is not execution. It is shame. And in the Middle Ages, public punishment was often more about humiliation than harm. Tonight, we explore how punishment was used to control women, not just through fear or pain, but through spectacle. Public rituals that reminded everyone who held the power. Let's begin with one common tool of punishment, the scold's bridle. This was a metal mask or cage, placed over the head and locked behind the ears. A flat piece of metal pressed down on the tongue, making it painful to speak. It was used on women who were considered too loud, too argumentative, or too independent. They were called scolds, a word that meant nagging wife, gossip, or any woman who spoke out. To the authorities, this wasn't just punishment. It was a warning, a message to other women, stay quiet. Imagine standing in a town square. You see a woman, red-faced, trembling, wearing a heavy iron mask. Children laugh. Men point. She is not bleeding, but she is breaking. Another common punishment was the ducking stool, a wooden chair fixed to a long beam. A woman accused of gossip or witchcraft was strapped in and dunked into cold water, again and again. The crowd watched. They cheered or mocked. This was not hidden behind court walls. It was a form of theater, punishment as performance. Even for lesser crimes, women were publicly shamed. A baker's wife who overcharged might be paraded through town. A young girl caught kissing might be whipped with willow branches. A widow who refused to remarry might be called a witch. Let's pause and think about this. Many of these crimes were not crimes at all. They were simply ways of being female outside what men expected. Too loud, too bold, too strange, too independent. Punishment was about more than guilt. It was about bringing women back into line. Now let's turn to the rituals of exposure. In some places, adulterous women were made to walk barefoot through town, wearing nothing but a shift, a thin linen undergarment. They might carry a candle or wear signs around their necks. Their heads might be shaved. Their families might be forced to watch. These acts were meant to strip away dignity. In other cases, women were locked in pillories, wooden frames that held the head and hands. They were exposed to wind, rain, and the eyes of strangers. People threw rotten food or shouted insults. It was not just the pain of standing there. It was the silence of being stared at, the judgment in every eye. Let's imagine a woman named Lena. She refused a marriage. Her father was furious. The town elders ruled that she had disobeyed a lawful order. She is placed in the square, with a sign that reads, "Wicked daughter." She does not cry. She does not speak. but inside she burns with quiet anger. She has not hurt anyone. She simply said no. Even religious spaces had punishments. Nuns who broke rules might be forced to fast, sleep on the floor, or wear different clothing. A woman who defied a priest might be made to kneel before the altar and confess aloud. All of this created a culture where obedience was survival, and shame was the tool used to shape behavior. Some punishments were symbolic, but others were deeply physical. Women accused of theft might be branded on the face. Women who fought back against their husbands might be locked away or beaten publicly. Women accused of witchcraft might be walked through the town with shaved heads and bare feet before any trial was held. And yet, despite this, some women endured. Some resisted the shame. A few returned to the square with heads high. Others escaped punishment by fleeing to another town. Some took back power by telling their own stories, reshaping the meaning of what had been done to them. Let's pause and picture a woman after the bridle has been removed. Her face is bruised. Her jaw aches. But when her sister touches her hand, she squeezes it, not in fear, but in strength. This kind of punishment was meant to isolate. But sometimes it had the opposite effect. Women found community in shared pain and solidarity in shared shame. Let's end this segment by imagining the quiet after the crowd has gone. The square is empty now. The wooden frame stands crooked in the wind. Somewhere nearby, a woman whispers to her daughter, "You do not deserve what they did. You are still whole." In the next segment, we will turn toward the world of marriage itself, to examine how the medieval household worked, how power was divided inside the home, and how women navigated their roles as wives, mothers, and silent managers. Inside the household, the silent power of wives and mothers. Now we open the wooden door to a medieval home. The air smells of bread, smoke, and old wood. In the corner, a pot bubbles over the fire. Children's voices echo softly. A man sits at a table, carving something from wood. But it is the woman who moves steadily through the room, unseen but not unimportant. Tonight we step inside the household, where control and care lived side by side, and where women, though often second in law, were first in labor, planning, and quiet decision-making. This was the woman's domain, but it was never truly hers. She worked, cleaned, taught, managed, and mended, all without legal authority. Still, she carried more weight than history often admits. Let us begin with the structure of a medieval household. The father or husband was officially the head. He made the legal decisions. He owned the property, even if it came from the wife's dowry. He decided where the family lived, what work was done, and how children were raised. But the woman, the wife, made the household run. She prepared food. She preserved it for winter. She controlled what was eaten and when. She tracked stores of grain and salted meat. She lit the fire in the morning and banked the coals at night. If the house had servants or children, she assigned their tasks. If her husband traveled, she managed things alone. If he fell ill, she made the choices. So while her power was not official, it was constant. She was the quiet engine of daily life. Imagine a woman in a small farmhouse. Her husband is away at market. She kneads dough, stitches a tunic, hushes a crying child, and checks the henhouse for eggs. Outside, the world may not see her as important. But inside these walls, she holds everything together. Marriage, for most women, was not about love. It was a contract shaped by property, lineage, and survival. A young woman might be married at 14, to a man twice her age. She might bring land or goods as part of her dowry, items which then belonged to her husband. In some places, she was expected to obey him in everything. The church taught that a husband was head of the wife, just as Christ was head of the church. Still, a wise woman often found influence, not through argument, but through patience, planning, and quiet persuasion. Let's pause and picture a noblewoman married to a minor lord. She knows her husband listens best when he is calm, not angry. She waits until after supper, then suggests a new idea for planting the fields. He thinks it's his idea. She smiles but says nothing. This is not deception. It is survival. Some wives used subtle tools, controlling access to supplies, guiding children's opinions, or managing relationships with neighbors. They were networkers, always balancing family honor, religious duty, and practical needs. The home was also a place of teaching. Mothers taught daughters how to cook, stitch, clean, and obey. They taught them how to move carefully, speak softly, and plan silently. Sons were taught their letters and prayers, sometimes by their mothers, before ever meeting a schoolmaster. Let us imagine a mother sitting with her daughter at dawn. The girl's hands are red from the cold. Her stitches are uneven. The mother says nothing. She simply shows her again, calm, steady, quiet. This is how knowledge was passed. In wealthier homes, noble women managed entire households or estates. They kept ledgers. They organized stores. They gave orders to cooks, stable hands, and chambermaids. Some could read and write. A few wrote letters to merchants, tracked income, or even paid taxes. These women were often alone when husbands were at war or traveling. And during those times, their quiet power became more visible. Still, if something went wrong, if a servant misbehaved or a crop failed, she was often blamed. Let's also speak of motherhood, which was central to a woman's identity, yet filled with risk and sorrow. A woman might bear 10 children, and see only half live to adulthood. She was expected to nurture them, but also discipline them. She trained daughters to become wives and watched sons grow into men who would one day rule over others, including her. A mother's love was deep, but she had little control over her children's futures. A father chose marriages. A lord chose training. The church chose schooling. Still, many women found ways to shape their children's lives with gentle guidance and whispered advice. Let us picture an old woman sitting by the hearth with her granddaughter. She tells her how to bake bread without measuring, how to read a husband's moods, how to stay silent when silence is safety. This wisdom will never be written, but it is no less real. Sometimes, the home became a place of harm. A husband could beat his wife with impunity in many places. The law allowed it, as long as he didn't kill her. If she fled, the courts might send her back. Women who tried to speak out were often ignored. The home was seen as a private world, ruled by the man. But still, women found ways to protect themselves, by forming quiet friendships with neighbors, by hiding small sums of money, by seeking refuge in convents or with relatives. And some resisted directly, leaving abusive homes, defending themselves in court, or even in rare cases, fighting back with words or fists. Let's end this segment with a final picture. A woman sitting alone at night beside a dying fire. The house is still. She has worked since before sunrise. Tomorrow will be the same. But for a moment, she closes her eyes, breathes deeply, and rests. She is not free, but she endures. In the next segment, we will turn to the stories told about women, myths, saints, and sinners, and how those stories help define what women were expected to be, and what happened when they failed to meet those ideals. Let us now step into a different kind of space, not a room or a street, but the quiet chamber of a story. A place where truth, myth, and morality all meet. Where lessons are taught not by law, but by example. Where women are shown not as they were, but as they were expected to be. Tonight, we explore the world of saints and sinners, the tales that shaped how medieval women were seen, how they were taught to behave, and how men used these stories to enforce control. Let's begin with the Virgin Mary, the most powerful female figure in medieval Christianity, and the ideal against which all women were measured. Mary was quiet, gentle, obedient, and pure. She submitted to God's will. She bore a child without desire. She served silently, loved without sin, and suffered without complaint. She was a symbol of holy motherhood, and yet an impossible model, both mother and virgin, both human and divine. No woman could truly match her, but all were told to try. Imagine a young girl in church, watching a stained glass window glow with Mary's image. Soft blue robes, downcast eyes, hands folded. She is told this is the perfect woman. She wonders if she can ever be enough. Now contrast this with Eve, the first woman, whose curiosity brought sin into the world. She ate the fruit. She tempted Adam. She listened to the serpent. To many medieval thinkers, Eve represented weakness, disobedience, and danger. From her came pain in childbirth, submission in marriage, and the need for male rule. Together, these two women, Mary and Eve, formed a kind of mirror. One holy, one fallen. One worshipped, the other blamed. And every woman was seen as some mixture of the two. Let us now turn to the female saints, whose stories filled sermons, stained glass, and bedtime tales. Many were noble girls who refused marriage, choosing instead to serve God. Some were tortured for their faith, others died protecting their chastity. Their stories often followed a pattern: temptation, resistance, suffering, and holy death. Take Saint Agnes, a girl of 13 who refused a wealthy suitor. She was dragged through the streets, exposed, and executed. Or Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who debated pagan scholars, was imprisoned, and finally beheaded. These stories were not told just to inspire. They were told to instruct, to show that true female virtue meant obedience, purity, and silence in suffering. A woman who spoke too much, fought back, or lived outside the church's path was not a saint. She became a cautionary tale. Now think of the sinner stories, the women who fell, the wife who cheated, the girl who danced, the widow who spoke her mind. These women might be cast as witches, temptresses, or liars. Their stories were full of warning. A single mistake could lead to ruin. A curious woman might be possessed. A strong woman might be cursed. In some tales, women were even animals in disguise, sirens, foxes, serpents. Creatures of beauty and danger. Let's pause and think of a young bride, listening to a tale her mother tells by the fire. It is about a woman who disobeyed her husband and was turned into a bird. The lesson is clear, even if the girl does not fully understand it yet. Stay quiet, stay loyal, or be lost. These stories were everywhere, in church sermons, popular songs, carved into church pews and drawn in the margins of books. Some were told by men. Others were passed from woman to woman, shifting with each voice. And sometimes stories were used as tools of resistance. Some women told tales of clever wives who tricked foolish husbands, of girls who escaped marriage with wit, of women who hid money or outwitted their lords. These tales gave comfort, a sense of secret power, a quiet reminder that not all women accepted their roles without thought. Let's imagine a market square, early morning. A group of washerwomen share a laugh over a story, a wife who fed her husband herbs to keep him asleep while she ran her own business. The tale is silly, perhaps untrue, but it lingers. There were also women who wrote their own stories. Marie de France, a poet in the 12th century, told tales of love, loss, and loyalty. Some of her heroines were bold, passionate, and clever. They loved deeply. They made hard choices. They did not always obey. Her work was rare, but it showed that women had voices, even if those voices were often lost or ignored. Other women wrote prayers, visions, or biographies of saints. Some described dreams. Others wrote letters full of longing, hope, or sorrow. These were not loud rebellions, but quiet acts of self-expression. They offered a glimpse into women's inner lives, their fears, their wisdom, their strength. Let us end this segment with one of those moments. A mother telling her daughter the story of Saint Margaret, who was swallowed by a dragon but burst free because of her faith. The daughter listens with wide eyes. The dragon is frightening. The escape is thrilling. But most of all, she remembers that the woman in the story was brave. In the next segment, we will walk the fine line between love and control, looking at how relationships, affection, and marriage contracts mixed personal feeling with power and expectation. Love, obedience, and the marriage contract. Now we turn to a quieter, more personal space, a space many dream of, yet few control. The space of love. In the medieval world, love did not begin with flowers or whispers beneath moonlit balconies. It often began with negotiation, property, and contracts sealed with wax. Tonight, we will explore how love and control lived side by side in medieval marriages. We will look at how affection could bloom in harsh soil, and how women navigated relationships shaped more by law than by feeling. Let's begin with the idea of marriage. Marriage was not just a personal choice. It was a social agreement, a religious duty, and a legal contract, often made between families, not lovers. Especially among the wealthy, marriages were arranged to build alliances, share land, or settle disputes. A girl might be promised while still a child. Her dowry, land, livestock, or coin would be planned before she had learned to read. Sometimes, she would not even meet her husband until the wedding day. Let's imagine a noble girl of 12, standing beside her father while a clerk reads out her marriage agreement. Her husband-to-be is 28. She stares at the floor. No one asks if she wants this. Even among peasants, marriage had rules. Couples might choose each other more freely, but the church still needed to approve. The local priest might ask questions. Families would meet to agree on terms. A small gift, called a bride price, might be exchanged. Marriage was expected. A woman who remained single too long was called strange. A widow who refused to remarry could be questioned. To be unmarried was to live outside the pattern. And once married, a woman's role was clearly defined. The church taught that the man ruled the home, and the woman must obey. Let's pause and imagine a priest's sermon on Sunday morning. He reads from Paul's letter. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. The women in the crowd listen, some silently, others already reciting the words in their minds. They've heard it many times before. Still, within this structure, love did exist, not always as passion, but as companionship, loyalty, and shared survival. Some couples grew close over years of shared work and hardship. A wife might care for her husband through illness. A husband might defend his wife's honor. In quiet moments, there might be laughter, shared stories, or whispered prayers before sleep. But love always sat beneath obedience. A woman's body, once married, was no longer fully hers. The church taught that refusing intimacy with one's husband was a sin. A wife could not legally say no. In many places, this was not seen as cruelty, it was seen as duty. And yet, some women pushed back. A few refused marriage altogether. Others used cleverness to delay weddings. A handful escaped bad matches by claiming religious visions or entering convents. Some wives, when treated with cruelty, ran away. Some went to court to seek annulment, though few were granted. Let's imagine a woman named Clara. She was married at 15 to a man who drinks and shouts. She tries to leave, but the court says no. Her father says it is her duty to stay. But Clara begins hiding small coins. She writes to her cousin in another town. One day she is gone. Not all resistance looked like this. Some women found quiet ways to carve out space within their marriages. A wife might pretend to misunderstand a command. She might take longer at the market. She might teach her children her own values, slowly and gently, even if they differed from her husband's. These were small freedoms, but they mattered. There was also the world of courtly love, poems and songs written about knights who loved noble ladies from afar. In these stories, the woman was pure, powerful, and unreachable. The man suffered for her attention, wrote her letters, praised her beauty. These tales were filled with longing, but rarely reflected real life. They were a kind of fantasy, where women held power over hearts, even if not over law. Still, they shaped how people thought about love. They gave women a role, even if that role was often distant or idealized. Let's picture a merchant's daughter, reading a page of verse by candlelight. It tells of a knight who waits 7 years for a single kiss. She smiles softly. She knows life is not like the song. But the dream is gentle, and she keeps it close. Love could also be dangerous. If a woman loved outside marriage, she risked ruin. Adultery could mean exile, public shame, or worse. For men, the punishment was often less severe. Some women risked it anyway. Letters survive, written in secret, full of longing, sorrow, and quiet strength. And some marriages did grow into true love, slow, ordinary, imperfect love. Built over time, shaped by shared chores, births and losses, evenings by the fire. It was not always dramatic, but it was real. Let us end this segment with a picture of such a moment. A man and woman sit side by side after supper. They say little. She stitches a torn shirt. He sharpens a blade. Outside, the wind moves through the trees. Inside, the silence is easy. They are not equal in law. But here, they are simply two people, side by side in the stillness. In the next segment, we will step beyond Europe to explore how women in other parts of the medieval world were also shaped by systems of control, and how their stories offer contrast and connection to those we've already heard. Beyond Europe, medieval women across the world. Now we turn our eyes outward, past the castles and cloisters of Europe, past the cobbled towns and smoky hearths, to other lands where different languages, customs, and beliefs shaped the lives of women. Tonight, we travel beyond borders to see how medieval women across the world were also shaped by power, duty, and quiet resistance, in ways both familiar and strikingly different. Let us begin with the Islamic world during the Middle Ages, a vast region stretching from Spain to Persia to parts of Africa and India. In many Islamic societies, women lived under male guardianship, much like in Europe. A woman's father or husband often controlled her movements, money, and marriage. But here, religion and law sometimes gave women more defined legal rights than their European counterparts. For example, under Sharia law, a woman could inherit property. She could keep what she earned. She could even initiate divorce in certain cases. These rights were written, not just assumed. Imagine a woman in 12th century Cairo. She owns a shop selling perfumes. Her husband has his own business nearby. They live apart but remain married. She controls her income. She attends mosque. She is veiled in public but powerful in private. Still, not all women lived like this. In many regions, strict customs required women to stay indoors, speak only to male relatives, and live behind walls or curtains. This practice, sometimes called purdah, limited their movement and visibility. In wealthier families, women might be educated, write poetry, or study the Quran. In poorer families, women worked in fields, cooked, and raised children, much like women anywhere else. Let's turn now to China, where Confucian philosophy shaped women's lives for centuries. Here, the ideal woman was obedient, modest, and devoted to family. Her role was defined by the three obediences: to her father as a girl, her husband as a wife, and her son as a widow. Marriage was arranged. Foot binding, a painful practice that began in the 10th century, became widespread. Small feet were seen as beautiful and proper. But the process left many women unable to walk easily. It was a literal reshaping of the body to fit ideals of control and femininity. Still, women in China were not silent. Some became powerful matriarchs within extended families. Others were poets, painters, or philosophers. A few even ruled, like Wu Zetian, who declared herself emperor in the 7th century. Her rise was controversial. Her rule firm. Her legacy debated, but undeniable. Now let us cross to India, where Hindu, Buddhist, and later Islamic traditions all shaped women's lives. Women were expected to marry young, to serve their in-laws, and to be loyal unto death. In some regions and time periods, a widow might be encouraged, or even forced, to die with her husband, a practice known as sati. But this was never universal. In some parts of India, women owned land. In certain communities, matrilineal inheritance allowed women to pass property to daughters, not sons. Some women were highly educated, writing poetry, managing estates, and teaching philosophy. One such woman was Akka Mahadevi, a 12th century poet and mystic. She renounced her marriage, wore only her long hair, and wandered the countryside singing verses to God. Her words survive to this day, full of longing, courage, and quiet rebellion. Now let us visit Africa, where life varied widely from one region to another. In West African empires like Mali and Ghana, some women held public roles as merchants or community leaders. In certain groups, women had their own spaces of decision-making, called councils of mothers or female elders. In other areas, women farmed, traded, raised children, and kept traditions alive through oral storytelling. Imagine a griot, a storyteller, sitting beneath a baobab tree, sharing tales passed through generations. Her voice carries the history of her people. She may not read or write, but she holds the memory of centuries. Let's cross now to the Americas, where in many indigenous cultures, women played powerful roles. Among the Iroquois, for example, women chose chiefs, owned land, and controlled agriculture. Lineage passed through the mother. Clan mothers held real authority. In other regions, women were potters, weavers, spiritual guides, and farmers. Their labor kept entire societies running, even as European contact and colonization would soon reshape their worlds. Let's pause for a moment. Across all these places, from Japan to Morocco, from Nigeria to Norway, women lived under rules. Rules about how to dress, whom to marry, when to speak, and how to obey. But in every culture, they also found ways to shape their lives. Through stories, silence, education, community, prayer, and courage. Let us imagine a girl in medieval Korea, learning to recite poetry with her mother. Or a woman in Ethiopia, making bread and teaching her daughters the history of their people. Or a Sufi mystic in Persia, writing verses about divine love. These women did not know each other. They lived in different climates, under different laws. But their stories echo one another, stories of strength, restriction, and quiet endurance. Let's end this segment with a final image. A long table of women from around the world, sitting side by side. Their clothes are different. Their languages unknown to one another. But their eyes meet. They nod. They understand. In the next segment, we will return to Europe and explore how the church shaped not only women's roles in life, but also their hopes for the afterlife, and how heaven and hell were used to control their behavior. Let us now leave the world of stone houses and market stalls. Let us drift upward, into the invisible world that hovered above every medieval life. A world of angels, demons, saints, and sins. A place where every action was weighed not just by law, but by eternity. Tonight, we step into the realm of the soul, where the church offered promises of heaven, threats of hell, and rules meant to keep women in line, both in life and in death. From childhood, a medieval girl learned that God watched everything. Her thoughts, her words, her body, all were under divine gaze. If she followed the church's path, she might one day join the saints in heaven. If not, she risked eternal punishment. This teaching was not gentle. It was meant to shape behavior. Imagine a girl of 7, sitting in church. A priest speaks of flames, devils, and the agony of the damned. He tells the story of a proud woman, who scorned her husband and mocked the church. After death, she was dragged into the fire by demons with sharp claws. The girl clutches her mother's sleeve. She is too young to fully understand, but she remembers the fear. The church taught that a woman's soul was like a garden, delicate, easily ruined, and always in need of care. Her greatest virtue was chastity, keeping her body untouched until marriage, and then faithful to one man. Virginity was praised. Lust was condemned. If a woman sinned with her body, even against her will, she might be blamed. Her value could be lost. Her chances at heaven damaged. To be pure was to be close to God. To be impure was to invite shame, sickness, and damnation. This idea gave the church immense power. Through sermons, confessions, rituals, and rules, it guided not only how women behaved, but how they thought of themselves, as fragile, fallen, and in need of correction. Let us pause and picture a woman kneeling in a stone chapel. She has confessed to pride or anger, or a desire she cannot name. The priest gives her a penance, fasting, silence, or a long prayer. She leaves with lowered eyes. She has been forgiven, but also reminded of her place. Many women were taught that suffering was holy. To endure a harsh marriage, to live in poverty, or to remain obedient in the face of cruelty. These were seen as acts of spiritual beauty. Just as Christ had suffered on the cross, women were expected to bear pain without complaint. Saints like Margaret, Agnes, and Lucy were praised for refusing marriage, suffering torture, and dying in defense of their purity. These stories taught that obedient pain was noble, especially when felt by women. Even in death, women's lives were judged by these ideals. A woman who died young, unmarried, and virtuous might be seen as angelic. A woman who lived boldly or questioned authority might be remembered with suspicion. And then there was hell, described in sermons and art with vivid horror. Wicked women were said to be punished for vanity, lust, gossip, or pride. They were shown with snakes around their necks, bound in chains, or dragged by demons. These images were not hidden. They were carved into churches, painted on walls, and spoken from pulpits. And yet, not all women were frightened. Some found deep comfort in faith. They prayed, sang hymns, fasted with devotion, and joined convents not from fear, but from love. Let us imagine a nun in a quiet cell, writing prayers by candlelight. She feels God's presence like warm air on her face. She is not ruled by men here. She has chosen this path. Her obedience is not forced, it is freely given. Others, like Julian of Norwich, had spiritual visions that were gentle and loving. Julian wrote of a God who was like a mother, kind, patient, forgiving. Her words offered hope, not fear. Still, these softer voices were rare. Most religious teachings about women focused on sin, danger, and control. The church also offered one hope for freedom, through death and sainthood. If a woman gave up all worldly desires, lived in poverty, and suffered faithfully, she might one day be canonized. Her name remembered, her story told. But this path was steep and narrow. Most women would never walk it. Let's pause and picture a dying woman. She has lived a quiet life. She bore children, tended a garden, obeyed her husband. As she lies in bed, a priest offers last rites. He reminds her to confess her sins, to beg for mercy, to fear the flames. She closes her eyes. Does she feel peace or pressure? Heaven was offered, but only after a life of submission, sacrifice, and silence. Let us end this segment with a quieter vision. A young girl sitting in the back of a chapel, tracing her fingers over a carved image of Mary. She wonders what it means to be good. She wonders if she can be holy and still have her own thoughts. The church has told her who to be. But a small part of her, soft but steady, is beginning to ask questions. In the next segment, we will look at the world of work, how women labored in fields, shops, kitchens, and even behind the walls of castles, and how that labor was often invisible, though essential. Women at work, the hidden labor that held the world together. Now we step into the rhythm of the everyday. The creak of a spinning wheel, the clang of a blackened pot, the rustle of grain sacks, the low murmur of hands moving steadily through task after task. Tonight, we explore the world of work. Not the kind recorded in royal ledgers or carved into stone, but the hidden labor of medieval women. Quiet work, constant work, work that held homes, villages, and kingdoms together, even if few ever noticed it. Let us begin with the home, the first and constant place of women's labor. From sunrise to sundown, women cooked, cleaned, washed, and repaired. They ground grain between heavy stones. They churned butter, baked bread, salted fish, and stirred thick soups over open fires. In some homes, there were no servants. The wife did it all. In larger households, women managed teams of others, organizing schedules, assigning tasks, and maintaining supplies. She was the manager, even if she was never called that. Let's pause and picture a woman named Anselma. She wakes before dawn. She kneads dough while the fire catches. She checks the dried herbs, sharpens the spindle, and folds clothes beside her youngest child. She does not sit. She does not stop. By the time the sun is high, she has already worked a full day. Outside the home, women also labored in the fields. Peasant women helped sow crops, weed gardens, collect firewood, and gather water. In harvest season, they worked side by side with men, scything wheat, stacking sheaves, carrying bundles on their backs. They also managed kitchen gardens, where herbs, beans, onions, and cabbage were grown. These small gardens were essential, especially in hard winters. In towns, women took on roles in crafts and trades. They brewed ale, spun wool, dyed cloth, and stitched leather. Many worked as weavers, bakers, candlemakers, or seamstresses. Some joined guilds, though they were often denied full membership. Others worked unofficially, helping husbands in workshops or running small shops from their homes. Let's imagine a narrow street in medieval Paris. A woman sells ribbons and buttons from a stall near the bridge. Her hands are red from the cold, but she greets customers with a nod. Behind her, her daughter sews hems by candlelight. They are not rich, but they make enough. In many places, widows were allowed more economic freedom. If a woman's husband died, she might inherit the shop or tools. She might take over the business. Some did quite well, especially if they had sons to help. Still, most women were undervalued and underpaid. Their work was often considered an extension of their domestic role, not a trade in itself. A man who baked was a baker. A woman who baked was just doing her duty. Some women worked in service, as maids, laundresses, cooks, or wet nurses for noble families. These jobs were tiring and paid little, but for many poor women, they offered survival. A few found work as midwives, helping other women through birth. Midwives were respected in some communities, feared in others, especially if something went wrong. Let's pause to picture a midwife named Bruna. She carries herbs in a leather pouch and whispers prayers under her breath. She has delivered dozens of babies, sometimes by candlelight, sometimes in the cold. She is called in the dead of night and thanked quietly at dawn. In noble households, women's work looked different, but it was still work. A lady might oversee dozens of servants. She managed supplies, planned events, ensured meals were prepared correctly, and handled correspondence. She might stitch fine garments, teach children, or copy texts by hand. Noble women often had to stand in for their husbands when they were at war, managing estates, resolving disputes, even defending property in times of conflict. But because this work was done in fine clothes and within stone walls, it was often seen as leisure, though it was anything but. Some women became healers. They mixed herbs, treated wounds, and gave advice. Their knowledge was passed down by word of mouth, practical, tested, and deeply local. They were respected until their power threatened someone. Then they might be called witches. Let us imagine a healer in a small village. Her hands smell of sage and garlic. She wraps a boy's injured arm while his mother weeps beside her. She does not promise miracles. She works quietly. She has done this before. There were also women who worked in more difficult trades. Some labored as miners, carriers, or stable hands. Others worked in inns or bathhouses, places where reputation and survival often collided. Some became entertainers, traveling singers, or dancers. And some, often the most vulnerable, were drawn into sex work by choice or by desperation. Their labor was rarely protected, and they lived on the edges of towns, in both body and law. Still, many found ways to survive, to form bonds with others, and to care for their own. Let's end this segment with one final picture. A woman sits on a low stool, darning socks in fading light. Her back aches. The day has been long. But the house is clean, the children are fed, and the bread is rising. No one will thank her. But without her, nothing would hold. In the next segment, we will look at the tools women used to survive. Not just physical tools, but skills, stories, secrets, and subtle strategies that help them navigate a world built to control them. Echoes of silence, threads of strength. Now we draw the journey to a gentle close. The bells have quieted. The candles are low. The voices of the past, once whispered in corners and spoken behind closed doors, have faded into soft echoes. Tonight, we have wandered through the unseen rooms of the medieval world. We have opened doors not often studied. Not the grand halls of kings, but the kitchens of commoners. Not the battlefields, but the bedsides. Not the words of rulers, but the hush of women whose stories were rarely written down. We have seen how men tried to control women, through marriage, law, religion, punishment, and silence. And yet, at every turn, we found not just obedience, but resistance. Not just sorrow, but survival. A woman might be told to stay silent, but she whispered wisdom to her daughters. She might be married off, but she managed the household. She might be hidden in a convent, but she wrote music that echoed through time. She might be punished for speaking, but she still found ways to be heard. We have met saints, midwives, weavers, and wanderers. We have seen how women use small tools, herbs, stories, stitches, and memory, to shape their world in quiet ways. And we've explored how even in the most private space, the bedroom, power played its part. Through rules of sin, expectations of obedience, and teachings of eternal judgment, medieval men tried to shape the most personal choices a woman could make. But even there, even in the dim light of that most private room, women still found ways to think, to hope, and to imagine more. Not every woman was a rebel. Most were simply trying to live, to raise children, to stay warm, to survive another winter. But in their everyday choices, they shaped history just the same. Their legacies are not written in bold letters. They are stitched into samplers, tucked into songs, carved into old wooden spoons. They are remembered not in triumphs, but in habits that lasted for generations. And now, in this quiet hour, as the world outside softens and your eyes begin to grow heavy, their stories have joined your own. You have heard their names. You have walked their paths. You have listened with care. In doing so, you have honored them. So rest now. Let the sound of spinning wheels and church bells fade into dreams. Let the hum of voices become still. Let the past drift away like smoke from a hearth fire, warm and slow. You are safe. You are quiet. And you are not alone. Good night. Sleep well. History will wait.